and yet somebody who was great fun to be with, and somebody who was very interesting to be with as well.
Words we've heard from many of the people we've been speaking to this evening. Dr. Ian Greenshields, Reverend Dr. Ian Greenshields, moderator of the Church of Scotland. Thank you so much.
It is 9:30. It is 3 hours since we had the announcement from Buckingham Palace of the Queen's death. Chris Aldridge can bring us up to date.
Queen Elizabeth II has died at Balmoral at the age of 96. She'd reigned for 70 years and was the nation's longest-serving monarch. Buckingham Palace said she died peacefully this afternoon. Senior royals had gathered at the royal estate near Aberdeen after concerns were raised about her health. The new King, Charles III, said the passing of his beloved mother was a moment of greatest sadness. The new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, said the country had grown and flourished under the Queen's reign. She added that Queen Elizabeth stood for the very spirit of Great Britain. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, paid tribute to the Queen as a symbol of unity, saying she stood not for what the nation fought over, but what we agreed upon. World leaders have also been paying their respects. The President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, said her commitment and dedication were an example to the entire world. President Zelensky offered his condolences to the UK on behalf of all Ukrainians. President Putin paid his respects to the new king, wishing him courage and resilience after his mother's passing.
Thank you, Chris. Well, now to the Queen and the many prime ministers that she knew in her time. As head of state, she was above party politics, but she did maintain close contact with whoever was the prime minister of the day. There was the weekly audience at Buckingham Palace and the annual visit by the prime minister to Balmoral. Winston Churchill was in office when she came to the throne in 1952, the first of 15 party leaders who would occupy Downing Street during her reign. And as our political editor Chris Mason reports, her grasp of issues and her wise counsel were valued by them all.
The state opening of Parliament, pageantry, tradition, continuity, the connection between the head of state and democracy. As a constitutional monarch, Queen Elizabeth could not direct government policy.
Mr. Speaker, the Queen commands this honourable House to attend Her Majesty in the House of Peers immediately.
When MPs are summoned to attend the royal speech, the door to the Commons is ceremonially slammed in the face of the official sent to fetch them.
Black Rod!
Underlining the elected chamber's independence. For decade after decade, the voice and face, that of the Queen's, even though the words were not hers. They are written by the government.
I pray that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils.
Today is Victory in Europe Day.
Outside Buckingham Palace, the crowds cheered themselves hoarse. 7 times during VE Day, the royal family appeared on the balcony.
Her first Prime Minister was Sir Winston Churchill. As a young princess, she had celebrated VE Day alongside him. She was hugely fond of him. And the man who'd fought for her great-great-grandmother during the Boer War was proudly, even paternally protective of the new young Queen.
I, whose youth was passed in the august, unchallenged and tranquil glories of the Victorian era, may well feel a thrill in invoking once more the prayer and the anthem. God save the Queen.
Sir Anthony Eden ordered British forces to secure the Canal Zone, and it was part of their task to try to avoid civilian casualties.
Next, it was Anthony Eden. His decision to use military force in 1956, after the leader of Egypt had nationalised the Suez Canal, brought humiliation and his own downfall. The UK was not the world power it was. But in the 1950s, the Conservatives had no mechanism for electing new leaders.
From the palace, the Queen sent for Lord Hume to invite him to form a government.
Both Harold Macmillan and Alec Douglas-Hume were simply said to have emerged as Eden's successors. Potentially, it put the Queen in the uncomfortable position of having to choose between political rivals.
Lord Hume accepted Her Majesty's invitation. He was now on his way to number 10 as Prime Minister, an office few people until recently ever thought would be his.
The Britain that is going to be forged in the white heat of this revolution will be no place for restrictive practices.
Harold Wilson was the Queen's first Labour Prime Minister and hugely valued his weekly meetings with her.
But the fact that there is somebody different, separate, uncommitted, whose only concern is to see that Parliament and government reflect the decision of her people, that is something that one just doesn't have in presidential states.
Key to the monarch's role being kept in touch with what the government was planning, to offer guidance and, if necessary, warning. Edward Heath said he found her experience invaluable. And Jim Callaghan sometimes, although not always successfully, sought her advice.
I recall one occasion when I was perplexed about a particular problem, and I explained it to her, and I said, you know, I really don't know what to do about this. What would you do? And she looked at me with a twinkle in her eye and said, that's what you're paid for.
The Queen's own views were articulated in public very, very rarely indeed. And when they were, the words selected judiciously to avoid direct criticism. Take this speech to Parliament as Callaghan's government considered handing more power to Scotland.
I number kings and queens of England and of Scotland and princes of Wales among my ancestors. And so I can readily understand these aspirations. But I cannot forget that I was crowned Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony.
When Margaret Thatcher became the UK's first woman to be Prime Minister, it was reported the Queen had privately suggested she was uncaring.
Even if she did say it, all right, she may have felt something, but there was never any difficulty in saying anything to me. Any difficulty at all.
As head of state, Her Majesty had regular access to the world's most powerful leaders, and successive prime ministers recognised how valuable that soft power was.
The feeling in Moscow in the period I was there was just astonishing. It was actually like living with history.
Tapping into her knowledge, assured of her complete discretion.
But I have had quite a lot of prime ministers, and some stayed longer than others.
They were saying that it was...
They unburden themselves, or they tell me what's going on, or if they've got any problems. And sometimes one can help in that way too.
A new dawn has broken, has it not?
As Tony Blair's Labour Party swept into power, political change, constitutional continuity. Like the royal invitation to Balmoral, where the monarch and the head of her government could talk about matters of state, but also have a barbecue and share the washing up.
You've just been having tea, have you?
Yes, I just had tea with Prince Charles. It was very nice. Good.
It was odd to get used to, as it were, that it was all these people you've grown up with as the royal family and the Queen, you know, fussing around you and looking after you, and took a little bit of getting used to.
There were hours of government paperwork, full of the details of everything from international financial upheaval.
In extraordinary times, with financial markets ceasing to work, the government cannot just leave people on their own to be buffeted about.
To an independence referendum in Scotland.
If you don't like this government, it won't last forever. But if you leave the United Kingdom, that will be forever.
About which she asked voters to think carefully. Leaving the European Union.
The vote was held and the public gave their verdict. Brexit means Brexit.
To a worldwide coronavirus pandemic.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
And a cost of living crisis for many.
I am confident that together we can ride out the storm.
Continuity at times of political change. 15 prime ministers, different people of different parties from different ages. For 7 decades, the Queen worked with them all, at the heart of democracy, yet detached from it, providing advice, encouragement, counsel, continuity, and ever present for so long in a world of continuous change.
Chris Mason, our political editor there, and that 15th Prime Minister, she saw her come in only 2 days ago.
Many of you are writing in. Queen, obviously Queen of everybody. You'll have your own thoughts on this evening. Ken wrote and said, I'm so sad for this day having come. Can't stop crying. He's someone who can remember the death of George VI. Someone else saying, the Queen was important because she reminded me of home, what she's given us, a sense of home. Another message from somebody saying, I'd like more on the horses. Robert Lacey is with us. They were the thing that was most important to her, the correspondent says. Horses and hounds. Is that right? Is that?
I think just about the last official photograph issued of her was with 2 of her fell ponies. Do you remember? Even just a few weeks ago. She loved riding. I think it was because it gave her real freedom. She was very, very proficient as a rider, and actually, looking through the history of the sport of kings or queens, she actually, when you look back, Charles II, Edward VII or whatever, she was the most successful monarch ever at horse racing. And she did it by breeding her own horses. She didn't buy them. And I've had the good fortune to look at some of her pile of 20 handwritten letters she wrote to one of her trainers. And some people, as they get older, spend all their time thinking about crossword puzzles. She thought about which horse would be best mated with the next, and then what name to give it. And there are letters full of Oriole, should we try this? Because, I don't know if you know, when you breed a horse, the name of the new horse must have something from the dam and the sire.
Ah, okay.
So it was like a crossword for her to work out the clever names that combined
the names of the horses.
The horses that produced them.
Robert, thank you. Now, bringing you up to date here, Parliament is going to be gathering at noon tomorrow, and that will be to hear tributes to Her Majesty. It's also going to reconvene for a rare Saturday sitting for further tributes and reflections. We can talk to Harriet Harman, Labour MP for Camberwell and Peckham, mother of the House, the longest-serving female MP, first elected back in 1982. Harriet Harman, thank you for joining us this evening and your thoughts on this sad night for the nation.
Well, I think that what we're seeing is the end of what I really feel has been 70 years of constitutional alchemy, because the relationship between Queen Elizabeth and Parliament and government was so closely woven together. You know, her role was to underpin the system, but she never intervened in it. And I think that she reflected British values, but she never meddled in government policy. And to be able to do that so sure-footedly and deal with all those prime ministers with an uncanny sense of how she was to perform her role, even if sometimes they didn't know how to perform theirs, was really remarkable.
Yeah, remarkable duration of time. To what extent do you think Parliament will now be together? The nation will come together for this period of mourning?
Well, I think across Parliament, everyone recognises how important the Queen's role is. And it's not just a ceremonial role, although she does the state opening of Parliament and reads out the government's programme. We vote on bills, but they don't become laws until the royal assent is given. So she is the guarantee of the system, but without meddling in it. And it is really, it's easy to take for granted how sure-footedly she's done that over the last 70 years, and a daunting prospect for King Charles.
There are plenty of people, many of them in your party, Harriet, of course, who don't believe this is the right way to run a country, the right constitutional settlement. It's interesting to reflect that everybody, though, seems to have a personal respect for the way she made it or attempted to make it work.
And I think that is absolutely right. And over so many years, when you think that she stepped up at the age of just 25, but still, and we saw in those pictures with her asking Liz Truss to form a government and become a prime minister, she was still sparkling right up until the end. And I think that endurance and that commitment is respected by everybody. But for those people who think, well, we shouldn't be in favour of positions that are taken on by birth, and we shouldn't be in favour of hierarchy and elitism. The fact of what has happened over the last 70 years is that Parliament has been enabled to do its job with her underpinning the system and reflecting British values, but never overstepping the mark. She didn't shy away. She didn't avoid controversy by shying away from things. She did her role to the full, but she did her role and was an encouragement for us to do ours.
Harriet Harman, thank you very much. Thank you.
You're listening to a special programme across BBC Radio after the death of Her Majesty the Queen. Before we go live to Buckingham Palace, there are just many marks of respect and gestures of respect from around the world. EU flags are at half-mast in Brussels. President Biden has said that flags on all government buildings and US embassies around the world will be at half-mast until the Queen's funeral. There are buildings lit up overseas with Union flags, Dansk in Poland, for example. The Church of England's prayer that it has issued on the death of Her Majesty includes the words, "May her example continue to inspire us." And our colleague Paddy O'Connell has been outside Buckingham Palace for a few hours now. Paddy, describe the scene.
Well, Michelle, it's been a great privilege to be here, and it's not my first time, but it's a unique feeling to reflect on all of my life, as many listeners will know, with one head of state. She's gone from rationing to furlough. People have been talking to me about the 1950s. She's gone from Churchill to Truss. And of course, people have been talking to me about the pictures of her looking beaming on Tuesday in Balmoral. So we weren't expecting it. Everyone in their family talks about this. Elderly parents, people of 96, nature's going to take its course, but there's still a sense of shock. And of course, just great feeling of uncertainty. We are a country at a crossroads. I think your guests have been reflecting that, Michelle.
Yes, but the more you think about her life, Paddy, it does seem very fitting, doesn't it, that the end came in a place she really loved, and that 2 days ago we saw her, standing there greeting a new Prime Minister.
Well, I think the anecdotes that have been coming about behaving in Balmoral in the way that she wanted to be treated as a neighbour, not just as the monarch. That's where she loved to be. As many Scottish, if not more Scottish, family members in her bloodline than English. And so much news is coming. It's worth thinking about down here, miles away. The last time God Save the King was uttered out here was February 1952. And of course, I have heard a few people trying out that phrase for the first time in half a century. And it's been, all of us wondering about the news that's coming in. And I'm at the Victoria Memorial, and just the sense of history, all these young people around me in their teens, and they're sitting on the Victoria Memorial, which was built to honour her death in 1901. And someone's holding a Union flag on top of, as high up as they can get. There's so many young people around me here, Michelle.
Paddy, thank you very much. Paddy O'Connell at Buckingham Palace.
It's 10 to 10. Through this special programme, we've been sporadically bringing you some little sequences of history, the Queen in her own words and the words of people around her. It's clear the news of the Queen's death is being felt all over the world. In addition to the UK, head of state in 14 countries, she devoted much of her life to the preservation of ties between the Commonwealth. The significance of her international role was enshrined in the Commonwealth Oath, the Coronation Oath.
Will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Union of South Africa, Pakistan, and Ceylon, and of your possessions and the other territories to any of them belonging or pertaining, according to their respective laws and customs.
I solemnly promise so to do.
Within months of the coronation, the Queen and Prince Philip embarked on a world tour. It lasted from November 1953 to May 1954, covering 44,000 miles. And that year, she made her Christmas Day address from New Zealand.
What is really important to me is that I set out on this journey in order to see as much as possible of the people and countries of the Commonwealth and Empire, to learn at first hand something of their triumphs and difficulties, and something of their hopes and fears. At the same time, I want to show that the crown is not merely an abstract symbol of our unity, but a personal and living bond between you and me.
The Queen kept an interest in international affairs all the way through, including her interest more than the broadening of the Commonwealth and the diminishing British Empire. To mark the 25th anniversary of the United Nations Charter in 1970, she spoke to politicians in Westminster Hall of the importance of upholding peace around the world.
The struggle to make the ideals of the Charter become a reality must go on. The debates on human rights, so that the standards of human conduct can be raised, must continue. The development programs and the assault on world problems of overpopulation, hunger and poverty must be intensified. The peacekeeping activities which seek to protect mankind from potential conflict must be sustained. It is in the United Nations and in its work that we can all feel ourselves to be citizens of the world. Indeed, it is our only hope of controlling national passions, calming international tensions, and improving the conditions of all peace-loving people.
Well, throughout her reign, she continued to be a prominent figure on the global stage, respected by world leaders. And after the end of apartheid and the release of Nelson Mandela, she visited South Africa in 1995 and spoke of the changes she'd seen.
You have become one nation whose spirit of reconciliation is a shining example to the world. And I have come back to see for myself what is little short of a miracle. The events in South Africa of the last few years have helped to bring rays of sunshine to pierce the mist. May the sun shine ever brighter. Nkosi Sikoleli e-Africa.
Well, the Queen's relationship with President Mandela was believed to have been warm and informal, and he referred to her as my friend Elizabeth.
And you can see the international affection for her in the statements that have come from so many world leaders, lots of them in, adding in personal reflections. They are far from ordinary tributes. Our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, is on the line, and our royal correspondent, Johnny Diamond, is here in this studio. John, how would you characterise the many relationships and the time that she had on the international stage in these 70 years?
Well, I watched the Queen at, I don't know, must have been about 6 or 7 Commonwealth conferences. And she always managed to kind of put people completely at their ease. They would start off of these conferences. Sometimes that were difficult in the 80s, for instance, a lot of difficulties between different members, particularly Britain and others, about South Africa. And the way in which she kind of added a calming influence on what were likely to be quite kind of passionate discussions was really impressive. And I remember the Zambian president, Kenneth Kaunda, saying to me beforehand, before he had his first meeting with the Queen, that he was really, really nervous. He wanted to say various things that he felt that he ought to make, points that he ought to make. And somehow or another, this is what he said, she seemed to know all about it already, and she calmed the situation. She made him feel very much at home. His relationship with her was almost as close as Nelson Mandela's relationship with her later became. And she just had this constant use of her very considerable influence, only influence, nothing more than that, but always for peace, reconciliation, and a kind of general sense that there were better ways than shouting at one another to make the points they wanted to.
And clearly tremendous skill in navigating these personal relationships and all the diplomacy and the trickiness that these occasions can involve. Johnny, of course, very recently it was Joe Biden's visit here, there was the G7 Cornwall summit, there was the very tricky Donald Trump visit not long ago.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of talk about how it would be tricky. There was a lot of sort of activity on the streets, in particular in London, opposition to Donald Trump. In fact, it went terrifically well. Yes, I mean, there was talk about breaches of protocol and whether or not he'd stepped ahead of the Queen, etc., etc. But it clearly went well because he overstayed when it came to tea with the Queen, and he pronounced himself delighted by it. And we heard later that, of course, that she was one of the great draws to bring him here. But looking back on the international role, what you see is, in her footsteps, the step changes in history as well. The visit to Germany, as Germany came into the fold after the Second World War, a visit was greeted with enormous enthusiasm. The visit to China in the 1980s, as China came into the international community. The visit to Russia, once the regime which had killed her relatives was out of power. But for one visit, to pull one out, I would say, in particular when it comes to these islands, it would be the Irish visit, the visit to the Republic of Ireland in 2011. A visit that was initially destined to be just a couple of days. It turned into a 4-day visit, we gather, at her insistence. And a visit that visibly changed the relationship, a relationship that has been so troubled over decades and centuries, but visibly changed the relationship between Britain and Ireland. And that was the example of her being able to do what politicians could not.
Yeah. John, going back to South Africa, there were also those, very tricky times at the Commonwealth in the apartheid years.
Very difficult indeed. Almost at some one or two stages seemed about to pull the Commonwealth apart. It never actually did, because I don't think anybody wanted to kind of face up to the Queen and say, we don't want to come back to this kind of meeting. So, there again, she had that very calming influence. And, it isn't just a question of a figurehead being kind of led around by senior officials. Johnny Diamond was absolutely right just then about Ireland and about her staying twice as long as it was planned for her to do. She absolutely insisted, I think against the advice of some of the people, at any rate, around her, that she should go to the Garden of Remembrance in Dublin, where, the people of 1916, the Irish, at any rate, heroes of 1916 were commemorated. And that was her determination, not just a kind of a gentle wish, but actually a realization that for her to go there was going to change everything. Yeah. And indeed it did, and it has done to this day.
Yes. John Simpson, our World Affairs editor, Johnny Diamond, our royal correspondent, for now. Thank you to you as well. And of course, she was incredibly well-travelled, wasn't she? So many countries. I mean, she stopped only in recent years, but she absolutely did diplomacy in action, not just at a distance.
The Times have a beautiful quote, actually. I cannot lead you into battle. I do not give you laws or administer justice, but I can do something else. I can give you my heart and my devotion to these old islands and to all the peoples of our brotherhood of nations. It's coming up to 10 o'clock now. You're listening to a BBC News special. I am stepping out. Jim Naughtie will be taking over.
It's 10 o'clock. You're listening to a BBC News special with Michelle Hussain and James Naughtie to mark the death of Queen Elizabeth II. We'll be continuing to remember the Queen's life, and we'll hear from those who have observed close up that long reign. First, Chris Aldridge with a summary of the news.
Buckingham Palace has announced that Queen Elizabeth II, Britain's longest-serving monarch, has died at the age of 96. In a statement, officials said she passed away peacefully at Balmoral Castle, ending her reign of 70 years. Senior royals had travelled to be with her earlier after the palace announced that doctors had expressed concerns about her health. World leaders have been sending their condolences to the royal family. Our political correspondent Ione Wells reports.
Tributes have poured in from across the political divide. The Prime Minister, Liz Truss, has described Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II as the rock on which modern Britain was built.
She ascended the throne just after the Second World War. She championed the development of the Commonwealth from a small group of 7 countries to a family of 56 nations, spanning every continent of the world. We are now a modern, thriving, dynamic nation. She was the very spirit of Great Britain.
The leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, said the nation will always treasure her life of service and devotion, and said above the clashes of politics, she stood not for what the nation fought over, but what it agreed upon.
The late Queen has been simply the Queen, the only Queen. Above all else, our Queen. As we mourn her loss, we should also treasure her life, our longest-serving and greatest ever monarch.
The Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Ed Davey, called the Queen an ever-fixed mark in our lives. And the SNP leader, Nicola Sturgeon, said her life was one of extraordinary dedication and service.
Scotland loved, respected and admired her. And by all accounts, Her Majesty was really happier than when she was here in Scotland at her beloved Balmoral, a fact I have been privileged to observe personally. I hope it will be a source of comfort to her family that she spent her final days in a place that she loved so much.
Former Prime Ministers have all paid their tributes, with Boris Johnson calling today the country's saddest day, and Theresa May saying she was admired not just by her own people, but far beyond our family of nations.
Queen Elizabeth II was respected around the world, and her devotion to duty, she gave a lifetime of service. This was an inspiration to us all. But of course, we mustn't forget, while we're thinking of our own memories of her, that she was a mother, a grandmother and a great-grandmother, and my thoughts and prayers are with the royal family.
That is reflected in the tributes that have also poured in from international politicians too, with President Macron of France calling her a friend of France, and President Zelensky of Ukraine extending his condolences to this irreparable loss.
The crown passes immediately to her son Charles, who will be officially known as King Charles III. He said his mother's death was a moment of great sadness for him and his family, and that her loss would be deeply felt around the world. This evening, 2 members of Buckingham Palace staff posted the formal notice of the Queen's death on an easel on the railings outside. Crowds continue to gather and lay flowers there as people mourn her death and reflect on her long life. These visitors gave their reaction.
She was a wonderful lady. She dedicated her whole life to the nation, and we could just thank her for it.
It's devastating. She's going to be missed by so many people. She affected so many lives, and she was an absolutely amazing monarch.
She meant everything to me, my family, a sense of community, loyalty.
The news of the Queen's death has shocked people not just in the UK but around the world, where 14 other countries had her as head of state, including Australia, Canada and Jamaica. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called the Queen one of his favourite people in the world. Pope Francis paid tribute to what he called her life of unstinting service. National flags are flying at half-mast, including at the White House, where President Biden described the Queen as a stateswoman of unmatched dignity. His spokeswoman, Karine Jean-Pierre, extended her condolences.
The United Kingdom is one of our closest allies, and again, our hearts go to the people of the United Kingdom, to the Queen, and to her family.
Planned strikes by rail and postal workers have been called off in response to the Queen's death. Stoppages were due to be held on the 15th and 17th of September. And Royal Mail workers, members of the Communication Workers Union, who walked out this morning, have cancelled the second day of their strike tomorrow.
Chris Aldridge, thank you. You're listening to a BBC News special following the death of the Queen. And our royal correspondent, Johnny Diamond, is with me. Johnny, we've had a great deal of reflection on the Queen's life and what she brought to the country in the last few hours. Let's look ahead for a moment at what's likely to happen over the next few days. Clearly, there are detailed plans. They've not been officially announced yet. Can you give us a feeling for the shape of what lies ahead?
James, there are two interlinked paths now. There is one which reflects the mourning for the life of the Queen. That will focus at first on Balmoral and Scotland, and then at some point, I think the expectation is that the focus will change and move to the capital here, to London. And obviously there have been extensive preparations for a period of mourning and then eventually for a funeral. And that will take place over the next few days. The second path is about looking to the future, and it is about the new king. I think there is an expectation we will hear from the king. Obviously, he gave a statement pretty quickly after the death of the Queen was announced, but I would think we will hear from the king. And there will be a focus, I think, on continuity of the crown and a settling in of the head of state. The link between them is, of course, the mourning, which is both focused on the Queen, but also is felt by the King. And I think we will see that as a part of the continuity, but also a reflection of the personal loss that the King feels. So it will be a busy time, without any doubt, over the next few days. And it will be a time where we hear both about the life of the Queen, the mourning, the death of the Queen, but also get an understanding of the future that is to come.
It's interesting you make the point about the link between, as it were, the statecraft of the transition to the King's realm from what went before, as distinct from, the sense of mourning and the family grief for a mother, grandfather, grandmother and great-grandmother. Although, from the nation's point of view, the fact that the Queen was 96, lived a long and productive life to the end. Goodness me, she was giving a Prime Minister the seals of office 2 days before she died. So there is a sense in which it's not a tragic death. It's a death that will touch people very deeply. When they see a picture or hear her voice of some event that they've been at or they've seen, it will no doubt pierce them quite sharply. But there is a sense that it's a preparation for the next phase.
Yeah, it is very different from the death of her father, which very few of our listeners, of course, will remember. Yeah. But he was taken from her and taken from the nation really rather unexpected.
In his early 50s.
Indeed. The Queen, as we know, was 96. And as you say, had led a very, very full and productive life. And perhaps to the envy of some, had remained very active, really, to the end, as you say, really, until 2 days ago, 1 day ago. So yes, that I think means there will be perhaps more of a sense of appreciation of the decades that have come before, and less of the sense of shock and the stunned nation that there was in the death of her father, King George VI.
Johnny, for the moment, thanks again.
It's 9 minutes past 10. Let's look back at some of the tributes that have been paid today in these hours since we had news of the Queen's passing from our political leaders. The Prime Minister Liz Truss addressed the nation shortly after Buckingham Palace announced the news.
We are all devastated by the news that we have just heard from Balmoral. The death of Her Majesty the Queen is a huge shock to the nation and to the world. Queen Elizabeth II was the rock on which modern Britain was built. Our country has grown and flourished under her reign. Britain is the great country it is today because of her. She ascended the throne just after the Second World War. She championed the development of the Commonwealth from a small group of 7 countries to a family of 56 nations, spanning every continent of the world. Through thick and thin, Queen Elizabeth II provided us with the stability and the strength that we needed. She was the very spirit of Great Britain, and that spirit will endure. Today, the crown passes, as it has done for more than 1,000 years, to our new monarch, our new head of state, His Majesty, King Charles III. With the King's family, we mourn the loss of his mother, and as we mourn, we must come together as a people to support him, to help him bear the awesome responsibility that he now carries for us all. We offer him our loyalty and devotion, just as his mother devoted so much to so many for so long. And with the passing of the second Elizabethan age, we usher in a new era in the magnificent history of our great country, exactly as Her Majesty would have wished, by saying the words, "God save the King."
And the new King, Charles III, is expected to address the nation tomorrow. More tributes now. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon paid this tribute on behalf of the people of Scotland.
Like everyone across Scotland, the United Kingdom, indeed the world, I feel a deep sense of sadness on the death of Her Majesty the Queen. On behalf of the people of Scotland, I offer my sincere and heartfelt condolences to the King, the Queen Consort, and to the entire royal family. There will be many opportunities in the coming days to reflect fully on the Queen's extraordinary life and service. For more than 70 years, Queen Elizabeth has been the great constant in our national life. She has inspired us, on occasion comforted us, and always personified values we hold dear.
And the Welsh First Minister, Mark Drakeford, said this.
It is with great sadness that we learn today of the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. She has been the only monarch that most of us will remember, and today the country feels an immense loss. Throughout her long and exceptional life, as our longest reigning monarch, Her Majesty firmly upheld the values and traditions of the British monarchy. On behalf of the Welsh Government and people in all parts of Wales, I offer our deepest condolences to all Her Majesty's children and their families on this sad occasion.
Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales. We're now joined by Sir Nicholas Soames, former Conservative MP, of course, and grandson of Sir Winston Churchill, the Queen's first Prime Minister. And Sir Nicholas, you will have memories as a young boy of the relationship that your grandfather had with the young Queen.
Well, good evening, Jim, on a very black day indeed. Yes, I do. I mean, I can't pretend that I ever saw them together, because I didn't. But my grandfather, as you know, absolutely revered the Queen. He saw in her the sort of birth of a new Britain after the Second World War, the new Elizabethan age, as he christened it. And all his hopes and all his most cherished hopes actually were vested in her, I think. and they have been triumphantly vindicated by a lifetime of impeccable service.
It was an extraordinary coming together of a man whose life stretched back into the Victorian age, who'd, served in government during the First World War, who had then seen the country through the Second World War, of course. And here was this apparently fragile young woman put on the throne by two accidents, really. One, the abdication, and secondly, the early death of her father, probably hastened by the war, who suddenly found herself in a position where she was trying to find a voice to help to pull the country together after all those traumas, with a man who, was from a different generation, a different age. It was a remarkable coming together, wasn't it?
It was indeed, Jim. And of course, it's such an extraordinary thing, the telescope of history, when you think that the Queen's first Prime Minister had charged on a horse with a sword at the Battle of Omdurman.
Yeah.
While her present Prime Minister wasn't even born when she ascended the throne. And Churchill himself served 6 of the kings and queens of Britain. And I'm older than you are, Jim, I think.
Just.
We've only ever known one queen.
Yes.
And we've only ever known one monarch. And I've grown up in the shadow of that monarch.
Well, of course, this is the point that people have been making, for the last several hours, that for most people in the country, save those who are a good deal older than you or I, Sir Nicholas, have only known this glue that has helped to hold the country together without making a single political misstep in all those years. Now, you were a practicing politician to some extent, still are, and so you know how easy it is in the rocks and shoals of politics just to slip and make a fool of yourself and fall over and have to pick yourself up and so on. Here she was, treading some of the most treacherous waters between nations, between fractious political leaders in the Commonwealth, in Europe, with Ireland, everywhere else, and hardly a foot out of place.
No, never a foot wrong, and navigating, as you say, the most extraordinary difficulties and complexities, particularly in the Commonwealth and of course domestically. And I think it's one of the greatest things about the Queen's reign that she managed, in an era of brute celebrity, to retain a sort of familiarity with her people at the same time as being the mystique of the monarchy.
Well, that is quite an extraordinary achievement, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an exceptional achievement. And really, over 70 years, I think it is remarkable. And she did it by just being very, very, very good at what she did.
And that, of course, is the example and the challenge for King Charles III, a close friend of your own, whom you've known for many, many years, and whom you admire, for what he will take from his mother's example.
Well, he will take from his mother's example. He's been very well prepared indeed for this sad and black day. He will observe, of course, all the conventions of monarchy, and I expect him to do a really brilliant job. I think he will do it very well, but he undoubtedly will need the support of the whole country. And I thought what the Prime Minister said herself was very, very good. I thought that she struck exactly the right note, and we need to support King Charles III as he ascends to the throne.
To what extent do you think that he has absorbed the most important lessons of statesmanship, which he's now going to have to exercise, that ability to be at once familiar to the nation, someone to whom the nation can, look to for guidance and for support in times of trouble, and yet retain a kind of distance, which was, as you pointed out, one of the great achievements of the Queen, to be a friend and yet to be someone who was just a slight step away.
Yes, I think that's a very good description of it, Jim. And the answer is that he will, because he knows very, very well what are the conventions of the monarchy. And he's seen how brilliant his mother was at it, and I'm quite sure that he will be exactly the same. And it's well known that the Prince of Wales holds strong opinions on many on many of them. Indeed, he's been years ahead of lots of people on endless issues. But when he becomes, and now he is the king, clearly, he's in a different space altogether, and there can be no question of the expression of those views in the same way. It just won't happen.
It changes. And it's... I don't know, it must be daunting. You made the point, Sir Nicholas, that the Prince of Wales, as we knew him, King Charles III, as we now know him, has obviously known this day would come. He's prepared for it intellectually in all kinds of practical ways, thinking about how you run the show, whether it should be slimmed down or all these things. Of course he's thought about it, and yet today we shouldn't forget that this is a moment of personal transition, which has a great deal of sadness in it.
I think that's completely true, Jim. And, I think it's worth reflecting that the Prince of Wales is a dutiful son to a much-loved mother. He lost his father last year. It's not been a great time. And I think he inherits and ascends to the throne at a very, very difficult time for this country. And I am confident that everything that he has learnt from his mother's reign, he will apply diligently and studiously. I mean, there's no one I know who works as hard as the Prince of Wales does. I mean, he's so committed to so many excellent causes to which he devotes an enormous amount of time. And I think he will be a very, very wise, sage, sensible king. And just the right person, I think, to ascend to the throne at this time. But I don't think one wants to, in any way, forget that this is a very difficult time indeed.
Sir Nicholas Soames, thank you very much for joining us.
You're listening to our special programme across BBC radio stations with James Naughtie and Michelle Hussein. Let's turn to the Queen and her religious faith. She was a person of great faith. She was a committed Christian. We've heard about that already this afternoon, and she was also interested in the UK's other faith communities as well. Stephen Cottrell, the Archbishop of York, joins us now. Good evening, Archbishop.
Good evening.
I remember speaking to you really not so very long ago on the day of the St Paul's service to commemorate the Platinum Jubilee. What are your thoughts on the passing of Her Majesty?
Well, yes, I do remember that very happy day, but also I suppose that was the day, wasn't it, when we first realised that, something was up and the Queen's health was deteriorating. And I've just come back from York Minster where we cobbled together. We didn't even start planning the service till just after 7. The service took place at 8:30. And it was amazing how many people kind of in a very short space of time gathered together for a simple service of prayer and thanksgiving for the Queen's life. And I suppose we're all feeling a bit of shock really at the moment, first of all, as we know in our own families, and now we're experiencing it as the family of our nation. When someone dies, even if you know that death is approaching, it's still a terrible shock. So yes, we're shocked, but at the same time, we're very thankful. Her reign has been happy and glorious, and she represents a continuity and a stability, the likes of which I don't suppose any of us will ever see again. So yes, shock, obviously sorrow, but also profound thanksgiving, and probably most of all, as we gathered in York Minster this evening and offered prayer for the repose of her soul, for King Charles, for our nation, I think I was reminded of her great Christian faith. So as well as shock, as well as sorrow, as well as thanksgiving, also hope, that she lived and died in the hope of the Christian faith. And our world needs that hope, and we have much to learn from the example of her life and service.
Yes, I mean, certainly her religious faith was very important to her, and she'd spoken publicly about how it had sustained her at difficult points in her life, bereavement, for example. Remind me, did you get... I was going to say get to know her personally. I mean, she's the Queen, so there's, as someone described earlier, there's like an invisible moat around her. But through the course of your work, Did you get to spend
Yes, well,
time?
I did. Yes, I mean, I did a bit. I can't pretend that I knew her well. Of course I didn't. But I think what I did discover was there's been a long tradition which she inherited from her father, which carried on until only a year or so ago, that in January, when she was always in Sandringham, she would have a house parties at the weekends, and always a bishop was invited. And you knew when you became a bishop that you would get an invite, and sure enough, I did. And it was I was very nervous going to stay that weekend. But what impressed me over the course of the weekend, where I have to say, great fun, it was a time of great joy, was her Christian faith. And the reason I was there was, yes, as a guest, alongside other guests, but also there to be the person who led the prayers, to preach in Sandringham Parish Church on Sunday morning. And so what I saw in her that weekend was, oh goodness, this is a person whose faith really matters to them. In fact, I've since then said on many occasions, you can't really understand the Queen and her great sense of duty and service to the nation, her understanding of her place as Queen, as a vocation. You can't understand that without understanding her Christian faith, which is why, as I say, although we're shocked, although we're sorrowful, I am also praying tonight in thanksgiving and hopefulness for the repose of her soul. You know, the Christian prayer when someone dies is always, may they rest in peace and rise in glory. She believed that. And, you know, I suppose I want to say, again, to myself, to the people I'll be serving in our nation in the coming days, that this life is not all that there is. This life, however glorious it is, or indeed however hard it is not all that there is. There is more. And she knew that, and she lived by that. And in that hope, she died today in that hope. And of course, you won't be surprised to hear me say, at a time of challenge for our nation, of transition in all kinds of ways, I think we need that hope. And I hope, therefore, that as people remember and honour her life and her service to our nation, and I know people will want to do something with their shock and sorrow and their thanksgivings, the doors of our churches will be open. I don't just mean the Church of England, every denomination. And as I say, people were gathering in York Minster this evening. I know that thousands and thousands of people will come to our churches in the coming days. And I would say, come. Whatever your faith, whether you don't even think you have any faith, if you just need to come to a place where sorrows and joys can be taken seriously, come.
There's a line that stood out to me in the prayer that the Church of England has issued this evening. May her example continue to inspire us.
Yes, and that's precisely what my prayer has been, because, as I say, her life, it's a strange thing to say, really. We've got someone whose life was unimaginably different to all of our lives, yet it actually was a life of simplicity, of dedicated service. I mean, only 2 days ago, she was, receiving the new Prime Minister in Balmoral. And there's wonderful photos, which I think we're all going to treasure as the last images most of us will have seen of her, with a twinkle in her eye and a smile, doing her duty. I'm sure it'll be quoted many times in the coming days. The pledge she made in 1947, aged just 21, that whether her life would be long or short, it would be a life of service, pledging herself to the life of our nation. Now those are sometimes called old-fashioned values, these values of service and dedication and duty. I think of them as Christian values. I think they're what our world and our culture really, really needs. And so, yes, her example is something that we can all learn from, whether we think of ourselves as a Christian or not. Though, as I say, I would say, I don't think the Queen's service, example, faithfulness, makes sense without her knowing that even she, the Queen, bent the knee somewhere else to our Lord Jesus Christ.
Archbishop, thank you very much. Stephen Cottrell, the Archbishop of York.
10:30 now. We can go to North East Scotland. We were hearing about Balmoral from the Archbishop a moment ago, and our correspondent James Shaw is up in the North East, where, of course, the family has gathered at Balmoral. That place, James, you and I were there together on Tuesday for that moment at which one Prime Minister gave way to another, with the Queen taking the hand of each of them. That place where the family have gathered it's not just a place that she goes in the summer, some sort of cottage to get away from it all. I don't mean the fact that it's a castle rather than a cottage, but as a place, she was embedded in it, wasn't she? The surroundings, the countryside, the tranquility, and the privacy and community.
Yeah, all aspects, Jim, I think, of that place were significant for her, and many aspects of it she enjoyed. Walking in the countryside, having family barbecues in the grounds of the castle. It was a place, you're right, that she treasured, and of course there is this long royal tradition started by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in the 19th century of it being a holiday home for the royal family, and she honoured that tradition, and she enjoyed it. And it seems that she preferred to be in this corner of North East Scotland in preference to perhaps almost anywhere else in the world. And one thing I thought, you said there, of course, Jim, that we were both outside Balmoral on Tuesday. And that was one of the really striking things I thought about this week. The fact that we saw those still photos of the Queen with the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss. And in those photos, she looks alert. She looks as if she is focused on what is happening, perhaps even enjoying the significance of that event, still doing her duty, almost up to the last hour of her life. I mean, I think that is really extraordinary. I don't know if there is any parallel for that in the history of the royal family, but I think that's one of the things that will really stay with me from this week, is the fact that she was still doing her job, doing her duty, right up until the last week of her life.
And Balmoral, of course, is a place of mourning tonight. The family has gathered. Her children, her grandchildren are there. And we think that the King Charles III, and the Queen Consort will make their way to London tomorrow morning. Is that your understanding?
That's what we've been told. I think there was indeed an official announcement earlier on today, Jim, just, saying that the family, the senior members of it, many members, the closest members of the Queen's family are at the castle tonight, and that King Charles and the Queen Consort Camilla will travel to London tomorrow. We don't know the exact timing of that, when they will leave and when other members of the family will leave Balmoral. Perhaps they will want to stay there for a while because of that tranquility, the peace that you talked about, which is going to be in contrast to the momentous, the huge ceremonial, sombre events that are going to be happening over the next 10 days in London, in other parts of the United Kingdom. So maybe they will treasure the moments of tranquility which they are experiencing, of course, alongside the deep mourning that family is in this evening and tonight.
James Shaw in the North East, thank you very much. And of course the details of those events to which James referred have not been issued formally yet by Buckingham Palace, and it's expected in the next few hours, perhaps by tomorrow morning, we will know the shape of the national mourning which is to take place. We know it will obviously culminate in the funeral of the Queen, but the details of what is planned, meticulous planning has gone into a series of events which will unfold in the coming days. We wait to get the details.
It is just after 10:30 now. Chris can bring us all the reaction, the tributes and the developments.
Britain's longest reigning monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, has died at Balmoral at the age of 96. Her eldest son, who's now become King Charles III, said this was a moment of great sadness. Liz Truss described the Queen as the rock on which modern Britain was built. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, said she was a symbol of the best of us. The Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Ed Davies, said the Queen represented duty and courage, as well as warmth and compassion. Political and religious leaders around the world have been sending their condolences. President Biden described the Queen as a stateswoman of unmatched dignity and constancy. Flags over the White House and the Capitol building are flying at half-mast. The Russian President Vladimir Putin said she had rightly enjoyed the love and respect of her subjects. Pope Francis praised the Queen's steadfast faith. People have been leaving flowers at the gates of Balmoral, and a crowd of tens of thousands has gathered in front of Buckingham Palace. About 50 black cabs line the Mall under dark and rainy skies as a mark of tribute to the Queen.
Chris, thank you very much. Let's join our political editor, Chris Mason, now. It's about, just over 4 hours since we had the news of the Queen's passing from Buckingham Palace. And Chris, it was not long after that we heard from the Prime Minister. And we've heard from several of her predecessors over the course of the evening, all with their own tributes.
That's right, yeah. And so many of them focusing on those one-on-one moments. One of the privileges of being Prime Minister, the audiences that Prime Ministers have with the monarch once a week, usually in person at Buckingham Palace, in many ways illustrating the difference between the noise and hullabaloo of Westminster. That's the nature of political argument and debate, and then being able to contrast that with a trip to the palace in order to have a conversation, informal and crucially in private and with assured discretion about matters of state. And for 14 of the 15 Prime Ministers who enjoyed those audiences so regularly, of course, Liz Truss.
Yeah. Chris, we're going to leave it there with you because, as everyone listening will have heard, the line was not great. But let's just take a moment to take a long and detailed look back on the Queen's life. It was a life which was full of public service. That is something she committed herself to at an early age, and her devotion to that was as strong and unwavering at the end as it had been early on. She carried out her duties with honour and dignity, and in return she received respect and admiration. Here's our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell.
She wasn't born to be Queen, yet she became Britain's longest-lived and longest-reigning monarch. Across the decades, as society changed fundamentally, Elizabeth II was a constant and, for many, a reassuring symbol of national unity. It was a life, above all, which was guided by her sense of duty, something she'd first referred to in a broadcast at the age of 21.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor was born on the 21st of April 1926. She was the first child of the then King's second son, the Duke of York. 10 years later, Princess Elizabeth's life was transformed when her uncle, King Edward VIII, abandoned the throne to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson. The throne passed to her father, who became George VI. The early years of George's reign were dominated by the Second World War. Elizabeth was expected to play her part. With her younger sister Margaret, Elizabeth broadcast a message to children evacuated overseas.
When peace comes, remember, it will be for us, the children of today, to make the world of tomorrow a better and happier place. My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say good night to you. Come on, Margaret. Good night, children. Good night, and good luck to you all.
When she was 18, Elizabeth joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the women's branch of the British Army. As the war drew to a close, she joined other recruits learning how to drive and service military vehicles.
This is the BBC Home Service. The end of the war in Europe was officially announced by Mr. Churchill at 3 o'clock this afternoon.
Hundreds of thousands of people packed in the space in front of Buckingham Palace. The dense sea of faces, they stretch away down the Mall as far as you can see.
In May 1945, when crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace to celebrate the end of the war in Europe, Elizabeth slipped out to witness the scenes on London's streets.
I remember lines of unknown people linking arms and walking down Whitehall. All of us just swept along on a tide of happiness and relief. I think it was one of the most memorable nights of my life.
By then, Princess Elizabeth had fallen in love with Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten. He was nominally a Prince of Greece, though of largely Danish extraction, who was serving in the Royal Navy. The relationship had developed over several years. Their wedding in November 1947 was described by Winston Churchill as a flash of colour in grey post-war Britain.
And as the wedding march peals out gaily through the Abbey, the procession of the bride and bridegrooms moves now down through the 2,000 guests who are standing here, bowing as the procession passes towards the Great West Door.
The early years of their married life were relaxed, but that ended unexpectedly in 1952. Her father, George VI, died while Elizabeth was in East Africa.
It was in Kenya, at the Royal Hunting Lodge, that the news of the King's death reached his daughter. When she returned from a night in the forest, it was to learn that she is now the Queen, acceding to her father's throne immediately. There is no break in the continuity of the British monarchy.
Elizabeth's coronation the following year was televised. It was watched by millions.
O God, the crown of the faithful, bless, we beseech thee, this crown, and so sanctify thy servant Elizabeth, upon whose head this day thou dost place it for a sign of royal majesty.
The moment of the Queen's crowning is come.
She became Queen at a moment of immense change. Britain was recovering from the Second World War. The empire her ancestors had once ruled over was disappearing, to be replaced by the Commonwealth. In Britain in the 1960s, as society evolved, public attitudes to the monarchy changed. To combat the impression of a distant institution, the Queen was persuaded, not least by her husband, to allow television cameras to show her and her family, by now she had 4 children, at work and at play. The film Royal Family was groundbreaking.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, do you think you could bring up those papers that I was looking at yesterday?
It gave a glimpse behind the scenes.
Well, it seemed to me there was much too much about history in it, which obviously they know.
Yes.
Her own history. Perhaps there wasn't enough about trying to say thank you for, what they'd done.
A decade later, in 1977, the Silver Jubilee was celebrated with street parties, pageants and fireworks. Britain's respect for the monarchy was affirmed. In 1981, a disturbed youth fired 6 blank shots as she rode to the Trooping the Colour ceremony on Horse Guards Parade. A year later, a man was imprisoned for breaking into her palace bedroom. Away from such dramas, the Queen enjoyed being a constitutional monarch. She had the right to be consulted by her ministers, to advise and to warn. She took it seriously, adroitly handling the political side of her reign and her weekly meetings with her prime ministers. In the 1990s, the Queen allowed the cameras back in. This time, the focus was much more on her work. She spoke about her duties and the nature of her life.
If you live in this sort of life, you live very much by tradition and by continuity. You know exactly what you're going to be doing 2 months hence. Or this is what the younger members find difficult, is the regimented side of it.
By 1992, there'd been fairy tale royal weddings and painful separations. To cap it all, there was a fire at Windsor Castle, a grimly appropriate symbol of a family and an institution facing difficulties. Suffering from a sore throat, the Queen admitted in a speech that it had been a difficult 12 months.
1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
This is BBC Radio in London. According to the French news agency, a French government minister has said within the past few minutes that Diana, Princess of Wales, has died.
The death of Diana, Princess of Wales, in a car crash in Paris in 1997 shook the country and the monarchy. It was the Queen's most difficult week. She was accused of being out of touch when she stayed at her Balmoral estate in Scotland, caring for the young princes, William and Harry. When the Queen did return to London, she delivered an unprecedented live broadcast on the eve of Diana's funeral.
I, for one, believe there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death. I share in your determination to cherish her memory.
Her 50 years on the throne were marked in 2002. The year began with sadness, with the death of her mother and her younger sister, Margaret. The Queen had little time to mourn, though, as a major programme for her Golden Jubilee took her around the country. People turned out in their thousands. Once again, the cynics were proved wrong. One of the highlights of the Jubilee was a pop concert inside the grounds of Buckingham Palace. 3 years later, the once unthinkable became a reality. Prince Charles married his long-term companion, Camilla Parker Bowles. The Queen didn't attend the civil wedding ceremony, but she was present for the blessing at Windsor Castle. A year later, the Queen celebrated her 80th birthday. It was an opportunity to reflect on life as an octogenarian.
As one gets older, birthdays seem to come round quicker. They are therefore less obviously excuses for wider celebration than personal moments to count one's blessings. As Groucho Marx once said, anyone can get old. All you have to do is to live long enough.
She'd become the most travelled monarch in British history, making official or state visits to more than 100 different countries. Many were memorable. This was Australia a few months after her coronation.
She'd come a long way, that little lady. And all Sydney could think of was making that long journey worthwhile.
Others were groundbreaking, to West Germany in 1965, helping to heal relations after the Second World War. She also went on to visit China and Russia. Much of her foreign travel was to the countries of the Commonwealth, the association of nations which she championed throughout her reign. Her role as head of the Commonwealth was of great importance to her, and her fellow feeling with African leaders opposed to the apartheid regime in South Africa helped to overcome tensions within the Commonwealth in the 1980s. In May 2011, the Queen made one of the most significant state visits of her long reign when she became the first British monarch to travel to the Irish Republic since the country gained independence from the United Kingdom. In Dublin, she spoke of the painful legacy the two countries shared.
We could never forget those who have died or been injured and their families. To all those who have suffered as a consequence of our troubled past, I extend my sincere thoughts and deep sympathy. With the benefit of historical hindsight, we can all see things which we would wish had been done differently, or not at all.
A year later, she shook hands for the first time with Martin McGuinness, then Northern Ireland's Deputy First Minister, who'd once been a senior member of the IRA. In June 2012, a national service of thanksgiving was held at St Paul's Cathedral to mark the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. A month later, at the opening of the London Olympics, she played herself in a spoof James Bond film.
Good evening, Mr. Bond.
Good evening, Your Majesty.
By now she was a mother, a grandmother and a great-grandmother, and in September 2015 she became Britain's longest-serving monarch when she surpassed the length of Queen Victoria's reign. It wasn't something, the Queen said, that she'd ever aspired to.
Inevitably, a long life can pass by many milestones. My own is no exception. But I thank you all, and the many others at home and overseas, for your touching messages of great kindness.
She continued with her public duties well into her 90s. There was further family turmoil. Prince Andrew was forced to withdraw from public life over his ill-judged friendship with a convicted American sex offender and allegations, strongly denied, that he'd assaulted a 17-year-old girl. And the Sussexes, Harry and Meghan, decided that they wanted to step back from royal life. They were unsettling moments, presided over by a monarch who showed that her sense of commitment was undiminished. It was evident again during the coronavirus pandemic of 2020. The Queen, in isolation at Windsor for her own protection from the virus, broadcast a reassuring message to the nation.
We should take comfort that while we may have more still to endure, better days will return. We will be with our friends again. We will be with our families again. We will meet again.
Her personal resilience was tested in the spring of 2021 when her beloved husband Philip died 2 months short of his 100th birthday. At his funeral within Windsor Castle, curtailed by the social distancing requirements of the pandemic, the Queen seemed a solitary figure. But despite the great sadness of the loss of her husband of 73 years, there was never any question of her withdrawing from the path of duty. She marked the 70th anniversary of her accession to the throne, a record no other British monarch had achieved, in February 2022. By then it was apparent that she was rather more frail physically than before. Her doctors had advised her to take things a little easier. Light duties was the expression used by the palace. In a message to mark her 70 years on the throne, she said she was grateful for and humbled by the loyalty and affection she'd received throughout her reign. And she signed the statement, "Your servant, Elizabeth R." By June 2022, and the public celebration of her Platinum Jubilee, her declining health limited the events she could attend. There was, however, a delightful surprise, a pre-recorded appearance, a somewhat chaotic tea party with Paddington Bear.
Perhaps you would like a marmalade sandwich. I always keep one for emergencies.
So do I. I keep mine in here. For later.
This was a monarch at peace and enjoying herself. On the final day of the Jubilee celebrations, there was a final appearance on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. The national anthem was sung. A much-loved monarch acknowledged the many thousands who'd waited to greet her. The crowds cheered, but finally it was time to go. The Queen turned to depart from the balcony on which she'd first been seen as a baby in June 1927. There was an unspoken feeling that an era was drawing to a close. For decade after decade, Elizabeth II embodied the strengths of a constitutional monarch, a steadfast and reassuring presence in a constantly shifting world, representing a changing kingdom to itself and to the wider world. Hers was a life guided by Christian faith and by the unfaltering sense of duty to which she'd pledged herself on her 21st birthday. It was something she'd reflected on during her Silver Jubilee in 1977.
When I was 21, I pledged my life to the service of our people, and I asked for God's help to make good that vow. Although that vow was made in my salad days when I was green in judgment, I do not regret nor retract one word of it.
Voice of the Queen at her Silver Jubilee in 1977. That was Nicholas Witchell, a royal correspondent, and some of the highlights of her royal life. You will realise that all national BBC radio stations have been brought together for this special programme reflecting the life of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, whose death was announced a few hours ago by Buckingham Palace.
And with us in the studio is Giles Brandreth, former MP, writer, broadcaster and friend of the late Prince Philip. Initially, Giles, you knew him through a charity and then you got to know him and the Queen. It's fascinating to hear her talk about, her salad days when she was green in judgment. And really, it feels like, was she ever like that? It seems like her judgment was so finely tuned throughout her life.
She was a remarkable person, wasn't she? And a remarkable person for so long. I mean, she was very much, in my view, the best of people, and she always saw the best in people. She had a very happy childhood and was always grateful to that. Her mother, everyone was charmed by her mother. She loved her mother. The Queen adored her father, but she felt, I think, that she learnt kingship from her grandfather, George V, who was the king during the First World War, and whose death back in 1935 was the first sort of serious death that she as a little girl confronted. And she was interested in history. She learnt British history. she was conscious her favourite home, along with Balmoral, was undoubtedly Windsor Castle. And she loved being there. And she was aware that that was the history of the British monarchy, built, after the Norman conquest by William the Conqueror. Every sovereign from that time onwards had spent time at Windsor Castle. And so she knew that she was part of this heritage. She seemed to take it with such an even keel. She was always very even, very calm, very good-humoured. There was a lightness of touch about the Queen. But to see her and Prince Philip together, they were an extraordinary double act, because he was dynamic, thrusting, forward-looking, whereas she was naturally quite conservative. I asked her private secretary about that once. I said, is she quite conservative? He said, no, not conservative with anything but a small c. She does follow precedent. She likes things to be done the way they were, as a rule. But the reason she goes quite slowly, it's deliberate. She believes she should walk at the pace of the slowest person in the kingdom, so that no one in this country should ever feel left behind.
It's very interesting to hear you say that she learnt kingship from her grandfather, because this would have been the period between the age of about 10, when when it was obvious that the line of succession was changing, till the time that she became queen. But the model that she had then as a monarch was a monarch of a different age compared to hers.
Totally different age. And she was quite serious, I think, as a young person. I mean, her sister was allowed to be the playful one, whereas the Queen was serious. Right from an early age, she adored horses. She had little model horses, as well as her own ponies, given to her by her grandfather. But she, famously, she wrote an account when the old king died, and then there was the abdication, which caused trauma in the family. She wrote an account for her parents, at her father's suggestion, of their coronation for her parents, in her own beautiful handwriting. And she recorded how, going to the abbey, the carriage had been quite jolty at first, but we got used to it. And I think getting used to it was what it was all about. She used to say, well, the crown is very heavy, If you leant forward, you topple over. But so she wore it, the state crown, when doing her work, sitting in her drawing room. Literally, slippers and dressing gown on, and the crown on top, in order to get used to it. She took her duty very seriously. That was her life, driven by duty, sustained by faith, and kept happy by those passions, her dogs and her horses.
And a very solid marriage. Charles, thank you very much. Charles Brandreth.
What a lovely anecdote. We're going to go to Balmoral now. Giles was mentioning Windsor and Balmoral, so tied up in the Queen's life. James Cook, our correspondent, is at the gates of the castle now. It will be dark and I dare say wet, James. What developments do you expect in the morning when this first night has passed?
Well, the first thing to say is that the King himself is spending the night here at the Balmoral estate, this place that was so special to the Queen, the place that she is said to have perhaps loved more than any other place. And as you rightly suggest, Jim, life here does continue, and the constancy is represented in the fact that the power has been transferred. It's been handed from Queen Elizabeth to King Charles. And indeed, life continues on the estate as well. The River Dee continues to rush under Isambard Kingdom Brunel's bridge, just a short distance from me here. The rain, as you suggested, continues to teem down. And tomorrow, the wheels begin to turn. And we presume that at some point, the King himself will travel to London. And arrangements will be made for the funeral, although that is some time away now, isn't it?
Indeed. One of the things that was striking, James, at Balmoral on Tuesday, when the handover of power, not in a royal sense, but in a prime ministerial sense, took place, the last engagement that the Queen fulfilled as an official function, was that you had on the one hand the statecraft that was being displayed, transfer of power, and yet there was a kind of intimacy. This is something that was happening in a home, in a place that she loved, where she was completely embedded, not just in the castle and in the way of life there, but almost in the landscape. It's a place that is utterly synonymous with the life she wanted to lead in the summer and the autumn of each year since she was a child.
That's right. She has, as you say, been coming here for many years. And I think one point to note in that regard was the photograph that the royal family chose to release on the death of her beloved husband, the Duke of Edinburgh. It was a photograph taken just a short distance from here in the hills of this landscape on Royal Deeside. And to that point, the castle here was built for Queen Victoria in the 1850s, and on seeing Balmoral for the first time, she said all seemed to breathe freedom and peace and to make one forget the world and its sad travails.
Indeed, under what Byron called the steep frowning glories of dark Loch Nagar, that mountain which, well, you won't be able to see it, James, because it's dark, but you know where it is as well as I do, and it's gorgeous country. James Cook, outside Balmoral Castle. Thank you very much.
You're listening to BBC News with our special coverage in the aftermath of the announcement that Queen Elizabeth II, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, has died at the age of 96. This is BBC News with James Naughtie and Michelle Hussein, broadcasting on all the BBC's UK radio networks to mark the death of Queen Elizabeth II. We will continue to remember her life and to hear from those who have observed her long reign and seen her and have their own memories of her. First, though, to Chris Aldridge with a summary.
Queen Elizabeth II has died at her Balmoral estate in Aberdeenshire. She was 96 and had served as head of state for 70 years. In a statement, Clarence House confirmed that the new king, the Queen's eldest son, would be known as King Charles III. He said the death of his much-loved mother was a moment of great sadness for him and his family. The Queen had 15 prime ministers during her reign, and every living one has paid tribute. Sir Tony Blair said her reign had been glorious and the country had lost its matriarch. David Cameron said no words could adequately express the sense of loss the nation would feel. Boris Johnson said it was the country's saddest day. Liz Truss, Theresa May, Gordon Brown and Sir John Major have also been remembering Britain's longest-serving monarch.
She ascended the throne just after the Second World War. She championed the development of the Commonwealth from a small group of 7 countries to a family of 56 nations, spanning every continent of the world. We are now a modern, thriving, dynamic nation. She was the very spirit of Great Britain.
Queen Elizabeth II was respected around the world, and her devotion to duty, she gave a lifetime of service. This was an inspiration to us all. But of course, we mustn't forget, while we're thinking of our own memories of her, that she was a mother, a grandmother and a great-grandmother, and my thoughts and prayers are with the royal family.
It's the whole world that is in mourning tonight because she was a compassionate, dedicated, wonderful public servant. And as we saw this week, when she introduced and met a new Prime Minister, she served the people of this country right until the last.
There was a great deal of amusement in them. There was a great deal of humour in them. There was a bit of gossip in them. And apart from that, the serious matters that were discussed, I think people would have been extraordinarily surprised if they realised the depth of information the Queen had. She was always extraordinarily well briefed. And those meetings with the Queen were one of the better parts of a Prime Minister's week.
The leader of the largest party in Northern Ireland, Michelle O'Neill of Sinn Féin, said she was grateful for the Queen's significant contribution and determined efforts in advancing the peace and reconciliation process. The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, and the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, have also paid their respects.
On behalf of the Welsh Government and people in all parts of Wales, I offer our deepest condolences to all Her Majesty's children and their families on this sad occasion.
Scotland loved, respected and admired her. And by all accounts, Her Majesty was really happier than when she was here in Scotland at her beloved Balmoral, a fact I have been privileged to observe personally. I hope it will be a source of comfort to her family that she spent her final days in a place that she loved so much.
Commonwealth leaders have been expressing their sadness. India's Narendra Modi said she was a stalwart of our times. South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa said the pair had looked at letters she'd been sent by Nelson Mandela, who he said she had respected enormously. New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern and Canada's Justin Trudeau said it was a sad day for their countries.
I know I speak for all New Zealanders in conveying our deepest sympathy to members of the royal family and condolences to King Charles III on behalf of the government and New Zealanders at this time of enormous loss.
As her 12th Canadian Prime Minister, I'm having trouble believing that my last sit-down with her was my last. I will so miss those chats. She was thoughtful, wise, curious, helpful, funny, and so much more.
Other world leaders have reflected on her 70-year reign. Micheál Martin said she had been a wonderful friend of Ireland. Russia's Vladimir Putin said she had authority on the world stage. And Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky said it was a heavy loss for Europe and the world.
From all Ukrainians, I express sincere condolences to the royal family, the whole of the UK and the Commonwealth countries. Our thoughts and prayers are with you.
The world's other royal families have been making statements too. Sweden's King Carl Gustaf said she had always been dear to his family. King Philippe and Queen Mathilde of Belgium said she was an amazing personality. And Spain's King Felipe said she would be remembered as one of the greatest queens of all time.
Chris, thank you. Chris Aldridge there. Good evening. It is 11:05 and you're listening to a BBC News special with James Naughtie and Michelle Hussein. Before I turn to Johnny Diamond, our royal correspondent, I'm just going to read a little bit of President Macron's statement earlier because it has some really lovely lines in it. He writes of the Queen, the Queen of 16 Kingdoms loved France, which loved her back. This evening, the people of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth are mourning their Queen. The people of France join them in their grief. She who stood with the giants of the 20th century on the path of history has now left to join them. So many beautiful words, Johnny, have been written today. So many really beautiful tributes have been paid to the Queen. It's very striking, one after the other. People are really striving to find the words that sum up her life.
It is striking. I have to say, President Macron came up with some stunning lines just there, as he did on the occasion of the Queen's Jubilee, when he spoke of her being the golden thread that bound our two nations together. But wherever you look in the tributes that have come, to be honest, whether they've come from monarchs and presidents or whether they've come from those gathered outside Buckingham Palace and Balmoral, has come an eloquence that is breathtaking. And it is, it is a sign, again, a reminder of the affection in which the Queen was held, but also that something about her office brings out the best in those who are speaking of her as well. I mean, she who wrote so beautifully herself is now being spoken of with such grace and such measured respect. It is a tribute to her that the tributes to her are so beautiful.
Let's go back a few hours, if we may, to Balmoral, to the place where she died, and also to the gathering this evening and into tonight of her children and some of her grandchildren.
Yeah, I mean, we should ponder the fact that Balmoral, which she loved so much, her summer retreat for so many decades, was the place where she would end her life. It's not for us to speculate on whether that would have brought her pleasure, but it is worth noting that it was a place that she found tremendous peace. It was the sign, of course, that this was a much more serious condition than simply exhaustion when we heard that the members of her close family had changed their plans and were making their way with some haste towards Balmoral, a very serious sign. They are all still gathered there now, although Buckingham Palace, in its statement of the Queen's death, said that the new King and the Queen Consort would make their way to London tomorrow. And that is a sign and a reminder that this is more, obviously, than the death of a mother, a grandmother, a great-grandmother. This is the death of the head of state. And that position has now passed to the man we will now know as King Charles III. And so when he comes to London, yes, he will still be in mourning, and there will be reminders of that throughout the days to come. But he will also be a new head of state and a sign of the continuity both of the crown and of the nation it sits atop.
Johnny, for now, thank you.
Continuity. Let's talk about that and history with historian Sir Simon Sharma, who, of course, has written a history of Britain and put the Queen's reign in that context. Simon, as you look at it, there are obviously chance elements to this, longevity, the moment at which she came to the throne by a series of chance events, really, the abdication in 36, the early death of her father in 1952, and yet what that 70 years did in the sweep of 20th century and indeed 21st century British history is quite remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is, James. I think, if you think of actually all the other very long-lived monarchs, not as long-lived or long-reigned as her, but Elizabeth I and George III, indeed, and, of course, Queen Victoria, they all sort of had the wind at their backs in terms of the fact that Britain was more powerful, more prosperous, more dynamic when they died than at the beginning. But the Queen had to cope with all sorts of national traumas. The war, the first trauma really was that both her uncle did not want to be king and gave it up. Her father only, in a torturous way, had to become king, was agonized about it. He was, of course, famously shy, the brutal stammer, took the country through the war, came out of it. So the Queen, at 26, really, had to have some sense, even amidst all the kind of imperial stroke, Commonwealth grandeur of the coronation, that there were going to be rocky times ahead. And her whole reign is a history somehow of the difficulty of anchoring Britain again. But she turned out to be the anchor. You go back to, you remember well as I do, miners' strike, Suez, Aberfan, the terrible days of the bombing of the IRA, one atrocity which took the life of Mountbatten. And the Queen somehow was a symbol of the fact that none of that would shake a sense of national community. She was the embodiment, the personification of how you can be a nation without hating, without egomania, without the kind of indecency of making enemies.
It's interesting that if you look at it in the context in which you're putting it, Simon, if you take the period of the abdication when the monarchy was rocked, certainly from the family's point of view, to a point where it was in genuine danger. But then look at a period like the 60s, where the old conventions were falling away, the age of deference was behind us, and so on. If you'd said to people that the Queen would be as popular as she continued to be to the end of her life, and had these extraordinary moments, the Diamond Jubilee, the Platinum Jubilee, and when you hear these tributes today, I guess if we'd been talking in, let's say, 1966, we would have said it was unlikely that someone could stabilise an institution like that over the period that lay ahead.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's a very interesting, of all the Christmas messages, the most extraordinary was the famous one in 1983. Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister, where the Queen said two extraordinary things. She said, the problem of the world is and indeed within the Commonwealth, is the inequality of fortune between rich and poor nations. That, for a start, got the dander up, not just of Margaret Thatcher, but others, particularly Powell. But she said something a little later in the Christmas broadcast, even more insightful. She said technology, because it was all about communication, James. She said technology is a wonderful thing, but technology doesn't make for comradeship, tolerance, and I don't think she used the words affinity. So she had, I think, from her daily experience, the sense in which all the kind of bright sharpness of the new world of technology, the internet just starting, fell short when it came to what a national community, particularly one that was constantly searching of where it wanted to be in the world, actually craved. She saw that every year, the garden parties, just going to visit, town halls and villages and hospitals and all the rest of it. She lived it. So she lived a belief that actually that something was missing from modernity, and she was there to supply it.
And it was a kind of glue, wasn't it?
Yeah.
In social terms.
Well, I think also in national terms. I mean, I think the great moment of the whole reign was in my view, was the Irish visit. First of all, the visit
it was extraordinary.
The Dublin Castle speech, the visit, bowing her head at the Garden of Remembrance. Lord Mountbatten had been killed by an IRA bomb. Then shaking the hand of Martin McGuinness a year later, I think it was, when she went to Belfast. And she said in her speech at Dublin Castle, we are all the product of history, which goodness knows she was. But there are times when you have to forget a little. I understand the pain of family sacrifice. There again, she had this fantastic instinct of saying even my family understands what other families go through. And sometimes we have to move beyond history. That was an extraordinary thing to do.
Simon Sharma, thanks very much.
Giles Brandreth is still with us in the studio. And of course, Giles, you knew her personally as well. You were behind the scenes. Where did all of this come from? The attitude, the example that Simon's describing?
Part of it, of course, was her faith. Absolutely fundamental to her life was being sustained by faith, saying her prayers on her knees. She believed worship to her was central to her life. She would go on a Sunday morning to church privately and then be seen later going again to church for the public appearance. Faith was everything to her. So things like reconciliation and forgiveness, the things we were talking about in relation to Ireland, they were part and parcel of what she fundamentally believed. She was, I think, born quite a serious-minded girl. Winston Churchill first came across her in the 1920s when she was only 2 or 3 years of age, and he wrote to his wife that he'd met Princess Elizabeth, and what a serious-minded, determined little person she seemed to be. So she had this sort of resolute quality. And she also was extremely steady. She claimed that she learnt this from her mother, because during the war, when there were air raids, the Queen Mother resolutely refused to be seen running to the air raid shelter. She walked at a good pace. So the Queen learnt to keep an even pace. You never saw the Queen rushing anywhere. And people who followed her around the world on her many tours, there was no sovereign has ever travelled so far around the world as the Queen did. But they marvelled at the fact that the Queen never seemed to perspire. She never seemed to get hot and bothered. She always was cool. And a global figure, mentioning going around the world, in the news bulletin we talked about her 15 prime ministers. She never talked about her 15 prime ministers. She knew she'd had dozens. And she could literally, almost as a party piece, you could say, Mum, who's the Prime Minister of Zambia now? And she'd enjoy telling you. She was extraordinary. And of course, Monsieur Macron liked her. She spoke to him in French.
In perfect French. I remember being in Paris at the time of the Platinum Jubilee, and Macron's, the president's speech and his references to the Queen were extraordinary, really. I mean, they were very eloquent. He has that gift. But they were genuine. And there was a ceremony of relighting the eternal flame under the Arc de Triomphe, which was extraordinarily touching, given all the comings and goings between Paris and London in the last few years for reasons which we know.
She was the embodiment of world history. For somebody like Macron, she had known General Charles de Gaulle.
Well, quite.
When she was a teenage girl.
Yes.
Because he was the leader of the Free French based in London during the Second World War. She had met everybody and treated everybody as an equal. And she was a positive person. She took the role of being Queen seriously. She took, for example, the Order of the Garter seriously. This goes back hundreds of years. Honni soit qui mal y pense. Shame to him who evil thinks. She looked positively at everybody, wanted to see the best of everybody, and indeed she was the best of people, and I think as a consequence brought out the best in people.
I know someone who was once in a position where he was able to ask her of all the public figures that she'd known and talked to over the years, who had impressed her fundamentally the most? And without a flicker of hesitation, she replied Nelson Mandela. And when asked why, she said she had never met anyone with less rancour, who had more reason to be rancorous. A very interesting answer.
It's fascinating. I mean, that kind of consideration, that compassion, courtesy, kindness, generosity, but also such great good humour. That's the only regret I have about the Queen, is that we didn't see more until the end of her life of what a playful person she was. I once had a conversation with her about pantomime at Windsor Castle, asking her what her happiest times were at Windsor Castle. She said, "Oh, being the principal boy in the pantomime." Really? And she said she wouldn't mind having been an actress, but she became a queen. And towards the end of her life, we realised what a brilliant actress she would have been. I mean, my goodness. There she was with James Bond, and most recently with Paddington Bear.
Yes, the taking of the marmalade sandwich out of the handbag was perfectly timed.
It was, and I was working at the time of that with Dame Judi Dench. Dame Judi Dench said to me, "Oh, goodness, she's so good. She's going to be doing people like me out of work."
Charles, just to finish, talk a bit about the Queen and the late Duke and their relationship, what you observed of it, how they complemented each other.
It was for her a lifetime's relationship. They were both great-great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria. It's often said that they met in 1939 at Dartmouth, at a naval event. That's not true. They met before then. They were cousins. They knew one another. But from that time, 1939 onwards, she really had eyes for nobody else. And because there was that invisible moat around the Queen, no one could be quite normal with her. The only people who really could be normal with her were her parents, her sister, and her husband. Nobody else, could say to the Queen, could call the Queen darling, except Prince Philip. And nobody could say to Prince Philip, "Oh, Philip, do shut up," except the Queen. And she did.
Charles, thank you very much. Thanks for being with us, Charles Brandreth.
And now at 20 past 11 on this BBC News special, we're going to Northern Ireland. We've talked a lot about Ireland, North and South in the last few hours because the Queen's influence in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland was considerable, particularly in the last period of her reign. We're joined by Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, leader of the Democratic Unionist Party. And it's true, Sir Geoffrey, isn't it, that the tributes from all parties in Northern Ireland, and indeed from the Taoiseach and other political leaders in the Republic, are genuinely heartfelt?
I think that's absolutely right. And when the history of this period is recorded, I think there will be a recognition of the significance of the contribution of Her Majesty the Queen, not only in the era of the peace process in the latter years of her reign, but also during the dark days of our troubled past in Northern Ireland. When Her Majesty visited Northern Ireland, I remember on the occasion of her Silver Jubilee, being invited as a school child to a special event where there were children from all kinds of backgrounds and all types of schools in Northern Ireland gathered to celebrate that particular occasion. But I think it was, and so during the Troubles, she came, she visited, she spent time with people, and I think that offered hope to many in Northern Ireland in those very dark days. But also, of course, Her Majesty and her family were impacted by the Troubles in Northern Ireland with the tragic killing, the murder of Lord Mountbatten by the IRA, and that, I think, brought home to the Queen the depth of suffering in Northern Ireland and the impact that it has on families. And so when she would meet with victims on her many visits to Hillsborough, Royal Hillsborough as it now is in my constituency, she had a real empathy with people. She understood what they had been through. And I think one of the most remarkable moments in our journey to peace and relative stability was the Queen's visit to the Republic of Ireland.
Yes.
I think that was a truly cathartic moment in British-Irish relations, and I have no doubt that that visit and the Queen's remarks during the visit laid to rest some of the ghosts of Anglo-Irish history.
Well, indeed, that visit in 2011, Simon Sharma, the historian, was talking about it a moment ago and saying the speech at Dublin Castle was one that really touched, the heart of the difficulty that there had been between Dublin and London, just to put it in simple terms, for generations, really. And you can look back at it and say, well, was it necessary to do these kinds of symbolic acts? And in fact, the weight of that visit in setting to right some of the historic grievances and grumbles that had been lurking there in British-Irish relations for generations was considerable, and no individual politician would have been able to do that. Isn't that the point?
It is the point, and I think that's absolutely right. It wasn't just what the Queen said. It was the person who was saying it. It was, this wonderful woman who has been our sovereign, our head of state for so long, and symbolised for many on the island of Ireland. On the Unionist side, she is someone that we are intensely loyal to. She symbolises for us the embodiment of what it means to be British. But for others on the island of Ireland, of course, it is different. But here she was, the head of state of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, speaking words of healing. And I think that impacted across the divide in Northern Ireland on the island itself. And I think no one else could have delivered that. It wasn't just what she said, it was who she was and the manner in which she delivered it that made such a huge impact.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, thanks very much for joining us.
Well, the Queen always had to choose her words well and often extremely carefully. In 1940, at the height of the Blitz, the then Princess Elizabeth and her younger sister Margaret were moved from Buckingham Palace to Windsor Castle to escape the bombing. She was only 14, and that year was the one when she made her first public speech, and it was on BBC Radio's Children's Hour.
Thousands of you in this country have had to leave your homes and be separated from your fathers and mothers. My sister Margaret Rose and I feel so much for you, as we know from experience what it means to be away from those we love most of all.
In 1982, the year in which British troops went to defend the Falkland Islands, she spoke of its necessity.
We owe our independence to the seamen who fought the Armada nearly 400 years ago, and to Nelson and his band of brothers who destroyed Napoleon's dreams of invasion. Nor could the great battles for peace and freedom in the first half of the 20th century have been won without control of the seas. Earlier this year, in the South Atlantic, the Royal Navy and the Merchant Navy enabled our sailors, soldiers and airmen to go to the rescue of the Falkland Islanders, 8,000 miles across the ocean, and to reveal the professional skills and courage that could be called on in defence of basic freedoms.
When she visited the Republic of Ireland in 2011, it was the first time that a British monarch had visited since Ireland gained independence. And in a speech in Dublin, she spoke of a shared past, of shared pain and of reconciliation.
These events have touched us all, many of us personally, and are a painful legacy. We can never forget those who have died or been injured and their families. To all those who have suffered as a consequence of our troubled past, I extend my sincere thoughts and deep sympathy. With the benefit of historical hindsight, we can all see things which we would wish had been done differently, or not at all.
Most recently, she evoked wartime memories as she broadcast to the nation during the coronavirus lockdown in 2020.
We should take comfort that while we may have more still to endure, better days will return. We will be with our friends again. We will be with our families again. We will meet again.
Well, the Commonwealth was extremely important to the Queen throughout her life. Dr. Linda Yu is with us, Chair of the Royal Commonwealth Society. How will the Society remember her, Linda?
we're deeply honoured that she was our patron, and she was such a steadfast supporter of the charitable work of the Royal Commonwealth Society. We're actually the oldest society dedicated to the Commonwealth, but it wasn't just us. It was also about 250 other charities in the Commonwealth that she supported. And we were extremely honoured, I think, by her passion and her active engagement. Sometimes we think, well, she's a patron of so many things. How actively involved could she be? And I can say that in my time, I have been struck by how much she cared about, for instance, achieving pan-Commonwealth commitment to the Queen's Commonwealth Canopy, which is a project that we led where every Commonwealth country has committed to protecting some forests in perpetuity in her name. And I still remember every year we run the Queen's Commonwealth Essay Competition, which is an annual writing competition, the oldest in the world for school children. And not everyone would be keenly interested in the number of entries and what percentages have gone up from different countries, but we knew that she would be, and those numbers are always passed on to her office, because we know that she's very committed to young people, to the environment, and especially this year's theme was around service, and I think that's what she exemplified the most to all of us in the charitable sector in the Commonwealth.
And did it make a big difference to your work? I imagine it keeps everyone on their toes, because you know that the palace, the Queen herself, the word will come, asking these questions about the entries and about the topics.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I would say, especially the Queen's Commonwealth Canopy. That is actually the first environmental project in the Queen's name. She herself launched it in Malta in 2015 at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. So I still remember I joined the Society 6 years ago, so she was 90. And I think until we achieved it this year, there was a lot of questions around when we would make sure that we can deliver this global public good. So yes, and I think your point about how she can also really highlight important issues. I think that's also what I've been struck by lending her name to literacy, to the environment. It just elevates these issues into the spotlight. It inspires people to become involved. And to me, that's one of the, there's lots of things that's hugely admirable about the Queen, but her commitment to charities, I think, really stands out in the Commonwealth.
Dr. Linda Yu, Chair of the Royal Commonwealth Society, thank you.
It's just after 11:30. Let's get a summary of events from Chris Aldridge.
Queen Elizabeth II has died at the age of 96. In a statement, Buckingham Palace said she passed away peacefully at Balmoral Castle in Aberdeenshire. The crown transferred immediately to her son Charles, who will be known as King Charles III. He said his mother's death was a moment of great sadness for him and his family. Every living Prime Minister has paid tribute. Liz Truss said the Queen was the rock on which modern Britain was built. Sir Tony Blair said her reign had been glorious and the country had lost its matriarch. Commonwealth leaders have expressed their sadness. India's Narendra Modi said she was a stalwart of our times, while New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern said the Queen had worked until the very end on behalf of the people she loved. The world's other royal families have also reflected on her 70-year reign, with King Felipe of Spain saying she would be remembered as one of the greatest queens of all time. And from London to Wellington and to Washington, D.C., flags are being flown at half-mast.
Chris Aldridge, thank you very much. And indeed, of course, a flag at half-mast on Buckingham Palace. Our Home Affairs editor, Mark Easton, is there. And Mark, crowds were gathering early. It's been a pretty stormy old day, pretty wet in London. What's the scene there now?
There are still hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people here. I'm standing in front of one of the gates of the palace. People keep coming up and laying flowers at what's already a very significant-sized tribute to Her Majesty. And attached to the railings themselves, many people have put bunches of flowers in among the railings, but also a black and white Union flag. And taped to that is a quotation the Queen herself said after 9/11, "Grief is the price we pay for love." And one can really feel that love, that affection, that respect in the mood here right now. There are candles being lit, people treating this moment with enormous reverence, actually, a very sombre mood. And I do think that this is a very significant moment for Britain, because the Queen really was the kind of keystone in the nation's architecture, a sort of solid and immovable piece that held the country's image of itself in place.
It's interesting, Mark, that you're there outside the palace, because, of course, we can all remember scenes from the various jubilees, from celebrations of all kinds, weddings, indeed funerals too, where the crowds have surged down the Mall towards the palace, and where the Queen has led her family onto that balcony. We'll never see that again. The days of Spitfire fly-pasts are beginning to fade into the distance. There is a whole era which encapsulates the Second World War, all its aftermath, the immediate years, and the couple of generations that remembered it. And the Queen represented that, and in a sense that is slipping away, not to be forgotten, but to go out of the immediate minds of those who were born long afterwards.
I think that's exactly right. She was a representative of the greatest generation, and the values that she espoused throughout her long reign were those which I think were matched by many from that generation. But you know, what's interesting about the crowds here at Buckingham Palace is that they represent the great diversity of her kingdom in age, in ethnicity, in class and background. In fact, I'm struck by just how young the crowds are here. They certainly will not remember the Queen other than in the last perhaps 20 years or so.
That's a really interesting observation, that there are young people there in great numbers.
Very significant numbers, yes. And I think that they are here. I mean, there will be some, of course, who are here for the sort of Instagram moment, but one gets a powerful sense that actually they're here because they feel this is a moment in their lives, a moment of great import, and they want to be part of that. And they want to also, I think, to be together, actually. I think this is quite a discombobulating moment for the country. She was this great source of stability. She did, in her own words, ease the process of change. And we're now going to experience a very significant change, and she won't be there to ease it. And I think it's quite a moment, this.
Mark Easton, our home editor at Buckingham Palace. Thank you.
Looking at more of the front pages of tomorrow, where the papers have taken their pick of photographs over long reign, and the Financial Times has got a photograph of the Queen pictured a few decades ago, probably in her full evening dress and regalia, and the sun is all a black background and a purple masthead with the words, "We loved you, Mom." And alongside the picture, "We are proud you were our Queen." Helen Catt, our political correspondent, joins us from our Westminster studio. We've had political leaders' tributes already. Helen, what about proceedings in the Houses of Parliament?
There will be a chance for MPs tomorrow to start paying their own tributes to the Queen in the Commons. So the Commons will sit a little later than it was going to. It'll start at noon tomorrow and run through till 10 o'clock at night. There will also be a special sitting on Saturday, which will run from 2 in the afternoon until 10 o'clock at night, again to allow MPs to pay their tributes. And as you said, we've already had quite a lot of tributes come in from across the political spectrum. You heard earlier of Liz Truss standing in Downing Street. She opened the tributes, as she will do in the Commons tomorrow, talking about the Queen as having been the rock on which modern Britain was built, that she was loved and admired by people of the UK and across the world. We've also had tributes paid by the opposition leaders, as you would expect. Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, said that the Queen had been above the clashes of politics. She stood not for what the nation fought over, but for what it agreed upon. The Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Ed Davey, saying she'd been a reminder of our greatest generation and the sacrifices made for our freedom today.
It seems very fitting and important that one of her last acts in the last few days of her life was to meet and greet a new Prime Minister.
It was. The Queen fulfilled this role in Westminster. She had a special place in that she was above party politics, but she had this distinct role in the functioning of government, the functioning of democracy in the UK. And she was doing that right until the end, as you said, appointing a new Prime Minister just 2 days ago. Liz Truss, of course, the 15th Prime Minister that the Queen saw in Downing Street. Her first was Sir Winston Churchill. All 6 of those Prime Ministers who are still living, the former Prime Ministers who are still living, have paid their tributes, shared their memories, their condolences. And the themes that come through that sort of unite their tributes are that sense of duty, this devotion to duty that comes up several times. They talk about having, David Cameron, for example, said that she was the world's greatest public servant. And he talked about having really valued her sage advice and wise counsel in those weekly audiences that Prime Ministers had with the Queen. And again, that is something that was echoed by others, by Gordon Brown, who said she was considerate, she was caring, she was endlessly patient, he said, even when talking about the details of a boring budget. But most of all, he said, what shone through was her complete and utter dedication to the country.
Yes, it's been fascinating to hear the personal twists that there have been, and in all of these statements, whether they're from leaders here, leaders overseas as well. And now, after the period of mourning, in due course, it will be King Charles who has those audiences with the new Prime Minister.
It will. The monarch does play this role with government. They have that weekly audience with the Prime Minister, which certainly with the Queen, we know they really valued, because in a postcode, in somewhere where there is the sort of rough and tumble of political life, the monarch is a constant that is above all of that. And certainly, particularly the Queen, because of the length of her reign, she was a real constant figure, in a sense, when governments come and governments go.
Helen Catt, political correspondent, thank you.
It's true that Prime Ministers have been talking through the day about those audiences. They can't give details of what passed between them and the Queen, but they've all indicated how valuable and how stimulating and indeed how testing these audiences were. And now, as Helen Catt and Michelle were saying, they will take place with King Charles III, who will begin, presumably after the period of mourning is over, to give weekly audiences to the Prime Minister Liz Truss, appointed by his mother on Tuesday. It is the start of a new reign, a new king. What kind of monarch will he be? Our royal correspondent Johnny Diamond looks at the life of the former Prince of Wales.
This is the BBC Home Service. It has just been announced from Buckingham Palace that Her Royal Highness Princess Elizabeth, Duchess of Edinburgh, was safely delivered of a prince at 9:14 p.m.
At his birth, the then poet laureate offered him the loyal love and service of a race. He was born into a very different nation, deferential and hierarchical, defined by victory in war and its ruinous economic price, destined to see its empire fall swiftly away.
Sirs, I here present unto you Queen Elizabeth, your undoubted Queen.
When Charles was 4 years old, his mother would become Queen. Her duties and her sense of service would cut into the time she spent with him. Aged 8, he went to boarding school, first in the south of England and then on to Scotland, to Gordonston, his father's school, which he hated. Solemn and serious, with low self-esteem, only at university did he start to become comfortable in his skin. In 1969 came the first ceremonial solemnity with Charles at its centre, his investiture as Prince of Wales at Carnarvon Castle. There would be time in the armed forces and a search for a role and a wife. Lady Diana Spencer was young and very beautiful and seemingly bowled over at the prospect of being a princess. Some wondered at what the introspective, bookish prince had in common with the teenager with little in the way of intellectual interests. But in the midst of economic depression and national division, much of the nation rejoiced at the regal fantasia of their wedding. They did not grow together. Instead, the marriage fell apart. But in the early years, children came and the cracks were covered up. And still the prince searched for a role. Back in the 70s, he'd founded the Prince's Trust to help develop the skills of disadvantaged young people.
I'm one of those people that feels that everybody's got some talent or potential or skill or whatever, which so often is not brought out and not developed at a young age by anybody in particular. And sometimes through lack of confidence and so on, these things don't materialise.
There were other, more controversial interests embraced and speeches made. Some now seem far-sighted. When he took up the cause of organic farming methods, they were viewed as quackery. Now they are mainstream. And very early on, he had supported environmental causes.
There is chemical pollution discharged into rivers from factories and chemical plants, which clogs up the rivers with toxic substances and adds to the filth in the seas. There is air pollution from smoke and fumes discharged by factories and from gases pumped out by endless cars and aeroplanes.
But his support for homeopathic medicine and healing, his outspokenness on some social issues, and his assaults on modern architecture led to complaints that he was abusing his unelected position. He pushed back.
I'm sometimes accused of wanting to return to the past, to encourage everyone to live in a kind of glorified Disneyland. That's not the case at all. But I do believe that if we are going to come up with an architecture we might actually like again, we have to strip away some of the nonsensical dogma of the day and think about fundamental principles once again.
And there was more to upset those who look to the monarchy for continuity in times of change. For 450 years, the sovereign has been Supreme Governor of the Church of England. The title Defender of the Faith has come to mean Defender of the Anglican Church. But the Prince said he wanted something different.
I personally, you see, would much rather see it as Defender of Faith, not the faith. Because it means just one particular interpretation of the faith, which I think is sometimes something that causes a great deal of problem. It has done for hundreds of years. People have fought each other to the death over these things. It seems to me a peculiar waste of people's energy.
Whilst his embrace of some causes won him plaudits, his outspokenness also caused alarm. In the 70s, he'd been nicknamed Action Man. But as the 80s wore on, there was more derision. And as his failing marriage became public knowledge, he began to lose the public relations battle waged with Princess Diana. By the early 90s, his marriage was dead in all but name. She put her side of the story into print through a friendly journalist. The marriage was over. The announcement came from the Prime Minister, John Major.
It is announced from Buckingham Palace that, with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate.
More and worse was to come. Public support for the Prince fell and fell as the Princess and her friends briefed relentlessly against him. In a documentary interview with Jonathan Dimbleby, the heir to the throne admitted his infidelity.
Did you try to be faithful and honourable to your wife when you took on the vow of marriage?
Yes, absolutely.
And you were?
Yes. Until it became irretrievably broken down. Us both having tried.
The couple divorced. In 1997, in Paris, tragedy. Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed when her car smashed into the pillar of an underpass. Charles's public position fell again. In the years that followed, he introduced his longtime love, Camilla Parker Bowles, to the British public. He was determined to bring her out of the shadows. And in 2005, they married, a civil ceremony followed by a blessing by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Prince still supported a dizzying array of causes, and it emerged that he was a regular correspondent with government ministers, urging them to act one way or another. His activism caused alarm in some circles. In 2018, in an interview to mark his 70th birthday, he drew a line between how he acted as Prince of Wales and how he would behave as sovereign. Would the activism, he was asked, continue as king?
No, it won't. I'm not that stupid. I do realise that it is a separate exercise being sovereign. So, of course, I understand entirely how that should operate. You could only do it with the agreement of ministers. That's how it works.
It has been a long and turbulent apprenticeship, often in the eye of controversy. A once troubled personal life, now in calmer waters, with decades spent considering the role he now inherits.
That report from Johnny Diamond, our royal correspondent. Well, let's talk a little more about the Queen's charities, which were very important to her, and she held many patronages until the last few years, really. We're joined by Sir Michael Aronson, former Chief Executive of Save the Children, and by Michelle Liuzou, Executive Director of Development and Innovation at Barnardo's, two of those charities, of which the Queen was a patron. Good evening to you both.
Good evening.
So, Michael, tell us about your experience of and your interactions with the Queen in her role.
Well, the Queen was our patron, and her daughter, Princess Anne, was our president. And obviously, Princess Anne was very involved with the charity, was very hard-working president. But the Queen was always there behind her. And every so often, I think probably because Princess Anne asked her, Her Majesty would grace us with attendance at an event, a reception, a fundraising event, whatever it was. And I think for the charity, having that seal of approval from somebody who was so important to the entire nation was really very, very beneficial to our cause and the work we were trying to do.
And on those occasions, how informed was she about your work?
Oh, she was always very well informed about everything. As I say, she wasn't as closely involved as Princess Anne was, but I've no doubt that she was immensely well informed and indeed proud of the work that her daughter did for us as our president. The monarchy is an institution, but the royal family is a family. And the Queen's daughter was our president, and I've no doubt that the Queen took a very active interest and was very proud of the role she played.
Michelle Liuzou, what about your experience at Barnardo's?
Yes, we were very privileged that the Queen was our patron for 30 years. And in 2016, she handed over the role to the Queen Consort, who had previously been our president. So she really supported our work with vulnerable children and young people, really helped to raise awareness. And also I think raise the morale of our staff and volunteers when she met with them, because they really loved her. And on the occasions that I was there when that happened, just seeing the difference it made to staff and volunteers was enormous.
That's interesting. So it's not just about donors or fundraising, it's about how it motivates the people who are doing the day-to-day work of the charity.
Yes, it's all those things, the cause, the fundraising and the morale of those who work for us.
Yes. So in a way, in a parallel to what Sir Michael Aronson was saying about Save the Children, so she handed over the patronage at Barnardo's to her daughter-in-law.
Yes, she did. Yes, along with at the time several other charities. She made the same decision, and I think that was about sharing that patronage within the royal family.
Which again is important, because then there's a follow-on from the influence and the impact that she's had. She's kind of making sure that there's someone else within her family who she can rely on and trust to do that role.
Absolutely, and we're incredibly grateful to our current patron, who is the Queen Consort, for her, continued support as we protect Bernardo's children and nurture those vulnerable children and young people right across the UK.
And Sir Michael Aronson, how did you find her personally?
Well, it was always a bit of a surprise, given her immense presence as our monarch and the huge weight of responsibilities that she bore. And when one actually met her, one was struck by the fact that she was physically quite a tiny person, and very calm and very quiet, but immense. What Michelle was talking about there, immense professionalism in making everybody feel welcome, everybody feel at ease, having time for people, really genuinely wanting to listen to what people had to say, not just passing down a line and shaking the odd hand. That's a great quality, and I think it certainly did mean an awful lot to people who met her, and certainly did provide an important stimulus to their motivation working for the charity.
Sir Michael Aronson and Michelle Lee Izu, thank you very much.
It's about 5 to 12 now. We're moving to the end of this news special, bringing all radio networks together. Let's hear some voices from abroad, because many have been making themselves heard in the course of the day. Here are two contributions to the tributes to the Queen. Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada.
In a complicated world, her steady grace and resolve brought comfort and strength to us all. Canada is in mourning. She was one of my favorite people in the world, and I will miss her so.
Justin Trudeau, and from another Commonwealth country, New Zealand, the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern.
The last days of the Queen's life captures who she was in so many ways, working till the very end on behalf of the people she loved. And that is why I'm sure that we will receive the news of her passing with both emotions of deep sadness, but also gratitude for a life that was utterly and completely devoted to the service of others.
The New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. And James Landale, our diplomatic correspondent, is with us. James, it is remarkable. You take these two clips that we've just heard from Commonwealth Prime Ministers. They're not just routine observations. They mean it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Mr. Trudeau could not keep the emotion out of his voice. He was breaking. He was close to tears. He's known the Queen since he was a boy.
Well, his father had known them
as
Prime Minister.
So, yeah. This is a woman that's, he's known personally for that length of time. And the one thing that, whenever I talk to world leaders, they constantly, particularly those in the Commonwealth, they all just raved about the Queen because of the impact and judgment that they could rely on.
One of the things that's always struck me about this is that the Queen, in the Commonwealth context, at Commonwealth conferences, for example, which you've attended over the years, can operate as a sort of, as a force in the room. She can bring people together, she can try to bang heads together, she can promote ideas in a way that she can't in the domestic political context at home. It gave her the chance to use some of those skills that all our Prime Ministers talk about in a way that she's prohibited from doing, quite rightly, in this country.
Yeah, and played a key role in keeping a lot of African countries together during the campaign against apartheid. Yeah. Very much also in terms of the formation of Zimbabwe and the last days of Rhodesia, at a time when there was talk of Commonwealth conferences not being held or her not being allowed to go because there was fear of assassination. She said, no, I've got to go. So in that context, she played a real diplomatic role in a way that was not interventionist, but she asked the right questions and she brought the convening power and just allowed a space to operate and exist for politicians to actually reach their solutions.
And I think, if you look at tributes, Joe Biden, for example, has said, in a world of constant change, she was a steadying presence and a source of comfort and pride for generations of Britons, including many who've never known their country without her. Her legacy will loom large in the pages of British history and in the story of our world. You're getting serious, practical politicians, Biden, Macron, to take two obvious examples. We're saying this is somebody who was actually at home on the world stage. If you're sitting at dinner and having to spend an evening with Donald Trump or whatever it happens to be, there's some difficult moments. But, that's a little it's 12 o'clock, we can say anything we like now, can't we? But, she was able to navigate some pretty choppy waters.
And that's in part because she knew more than anybody else. She had been reading diplomatic and intelligence documents since 1952. There was no other human being on earth who did that. And that meant that she could talk on equal terms with those leaders that she was engaged with.
And of course, for younger leaders, they thought to themselves, British Prime Minister thought, gosh, she used to talk to Churchill. And American leaders would say, she talked to Eisenhower and Kennedy. It's quite a thing to think about.
Yeah, and it meant that, they took what she said seriously in a way that didn't happen with anybody else.
We won't see her like again.
No, absolutely not. Certainly not on the international stage.
James Landale, thank you very much indeed.
Just a final word as we approach midnight and the end of this special programme about tomorrow morning's newspapers, the images of the Queen, of course, but the words that they have chosen, they are largely words of thanks or a life in service, about love for the Queen, broken hearts and her doing her duty. It says it all, really. This is the end of this special programme for BBC News at the end of this day when Queen Elizabeth II died at the age of 96. Thank you for listening from Jim, me and our colleagues across the newsroom. Good night.
And thank you to Jim and Michelle. Good evening, I'm Chris Warburton. It's just coming up to midnight and this is a 5 Live News special across BBC Radio. Tonight, it's really your chance to share your memories, your reactions, your reflections on the life of Queen Elizabeth II. Through the night and into tomorrow morning, we'll be live getting reaction from across the UK and across the world. Do call 08085 909 693, text 85058. First, a summary of the news.
BBC News at midnight, this is Adam Porter. Queen Elizabeth II has died at the age of 96, bringing to an end a 70-year reign that made her the longest-serving monarch in British history. Officials say she passed away peacefully at Balmoral Castle in Aberdeenshire. The crown has passed immediately to her son and heir Charles, who will officially be known as King Charles III. He said his mother's death would be deeply felt around the world. King Charles and his wife Camilla, now Queen Consort, will remain at Balmoral overnight before returning to London later today. Charles's eldest son, Prince William, has become the first in line to the throne. The country has now entered a 10-day period of mourning. Across the UK, people have been gathering outside royal residences to pay their respects. Earlier, members of a large crowd outside Buckingham Palace began to sing the national anthem. These mourners came to pay their respects to the Queen at Balmoral Castle, where she spent the last days of her life.
She's been a monarch for over 70 years and it's history, and we just wanted to be here to share our condolences.
It's really sad news to hear, actually. That's the reason we came. We were hoping to pass on our regards or just to be here.
Her significance was just incredible. And it doesn't really hit home, I don't think, until you hear something like this. And what she meant to us and what she meant to the country was absolutely incredible legacy.
The Prime Minister, Liz Truss, has led tributes among world leaders. She described the Queen as the rock on which modern Britain was built. Political leaders from across the 14 other Commonwealth realms that the Queen reigned over have expressed their shock and sadness. President Biden hailed the Queen as a stateswoman of unmatched dignity and constancy. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell says the Queen left an extraordinary mark on the history of the UK and the monarchy.
She has, I think, kept the monarchy strong at home. There have been ups and downs, bumps, of course there have, over the 70 years, bumps generally caused by other members of her family, as we've seen recently. But she, throughout it all, has embodied, I think, the best of qualities: duty and decency and tolerance.
Planned strikes by rail and postal workers have been called off following the Queen's death. Members of the RMT union were due to walk out on Thursday and Saturday next week. The Communication Workers Union had planned to continue a 48-hour walkout today. And the weather forecast: heavy rain in places in Scotland and Northern Ireland tonight, a few showers in England and Wales. BBC News, it's 3 minutes past midnight.
And good evening. This is BBC Radio 5 Live with me, Chris Warburton. I hope you're doing okay. It is hard to imagine the UK without the Queen, isn't it? For most of us, she has always been there. She's all we've ever known, really. Queen Elizabeth II was a woman who dedicated her life to a job that she never chose to do, dedicated to duty, but with the common touch, and committed to the very end. President Obama has talked about the Queen's authenticity, saying that when public figures have come and gone, when politicians let you down, here was someone who did not. And we shouldn't forget tonight that she was a mother, a grandmother, a great-grandmother, and a partner. And thoughts are very much with her very large family tonight. They clearly cared deeply for her, and she cared deeply for her country, for your country, for our country. And in the next couple of hours, the plan is to have reaction from across the UK and from across the world. We always say it, right? And we always mean it. 5 Live is your station. It is all about you. So do please share your reflections tonight. Wherever you are in the country, whatever your age, how are you absorbing this news? Do text, do call with your memories of the Queen, your thoughts on what she stood for, the values that she stood for. And if you ever met the Queen, spoke to her, saw her, I don't know, from your dad's shoulders, do share your memories. I spoke to one of my relatives earlier on today, as I guess so many of us will have done. Call your nearest and dearest on a day like this. This particular relative is in their late 70s, and they said the Queen has always been there, a constant through their life, when there are very few of those. Whatever moment of history, whatever major event, the Queen was there. And that will be true for virtually everyone listening to this programme tonight. So do share your thoughts. Text 85058. I'd really like to hear from you. Tweet at BBC 5 Live, and do give me a call as well. 08085 909 693. We'll hear tributes from around the world, from leaders from around the world in just a moment. But first, let's go to our correspondent, Kasia Madeira, who is at Buckingham Palace. Kasia, good evening. Give us a sense of how things have been there over the past few hours.
Chris, it's when you are asking for people to call in and reflect, there are so many people here who are still here. It's you know, we're talking about midnight in the UK, and it's been raining throughout the day, and yet there are still hundreds of people outside Buckingham Palace just wanting to reflect. Very peaceful, very quiet. Earlier on, there were the maximum, you know, at the height of the crowds, there were thousands of people here, and people were, as you were saying, spontaneously singing the national anthem, God Save the King. It's going to take a bit of getting used to, isn't it? But right now, it's very quiet. People kind of walking around. A lot of people very much near the palace gates themselves, wanting to read that statement that was issued, that's pinned to the railing walls whenever something important happens within the royal family, a significant moment, a royal birth. We've got that statement, that notice. So people very much wanting to be there, take an image of that. But it's really peaceful, it's quiet, it's somber, and you just sense that people are just coming to terms with what we've been hearing.
And I suppose this gives us a sense of how the country might remember the Queen publicly, you know, particularly over the next 10 days, Kasia.
Well, that's just it. You know, we talk about the future of this country, the change that this country will be going into. But right now, when you speak to the members of the public who are here, that are reflecting, and there are a lot of, you know, that completely across the age range, they want to think about Her Majesty the Queen.
not so much, we know about the popularity of the younger members of the royal family, but they want to reflect and they want to talk about the Queen because, so many years of service. And Chris, I'm sure you've heard one of the statistics, one of the facts that we've been hearing so much throughout the day. Her reign spanned 15 prime ministers.
Yes.
Beginning with Winston Churchill, who was born in 1874. It's just, you sense the history and the experience with Her Majesty.
Yes, 15 prime ministers and 13 US presidents. I think we'll get some reaction from the United States a little later. But Kasia, thank you very much indeed. Kasia Madeira reporting for us from Buckingham Palace. Thank you for the text you're already sending in. Phil from West Wales says, I feel like I've lost my nan. The Queen has been a constant in my 37-year life. Massive loss for our country and wider world, says Phil. Thank you for that. Another listener says, my name is Matt. I'm a 60-year-old man from the Isle of Wight. I live alone. Like the majority, I have never known anything else. I feel grief-stricken with the passing of our most amazing Queen. I'm reflecting on my own life and the lives of past loved ones that also knew no different. My point is, there are many tonight living alone, old, and some feeling profoundly, profoundly upset. Please pick up the phone and call them with love and compassion, says Matt. Appreciate that, Matt. Thank you. And Danielle says, I remember seeing the Queen come to visit Manchester. I'm deeply saddened by the news of the Queen passing and send my condolences to her family. Share your reflections, your thoughts on 85058 this evening. Leading the tributes, her son, the Queen's son, King Charles III, as Kasia said, it's going to take a little while, isn't it, I guess, for us to get our heads around the idea of King Charles III, says the death of his beloved mother is a moment of great sadness for the royal family. And the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, spoke outside Number 10 earlier on this evening.
Queen Elizabeth II was the rock on which modern Britain was built. Our country has grown and flourished under her reign. She was the very spirit of Great Britain, and that spirit will endure. She has been our longest ever reigning monarch. It's an extraordinary achievement to have presided with such dignity and grace for 70 years. And with the passing of the second Elizabethan age, we usher in a new era in the magnificent history of our great country, exactly as Her Majesty would have wished, by saying the words, God save the King.
The Prime Minister speaking outside Number 10 earlier. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has also paid tribute.
For the vast majority of us, the late Queen has been simply the Queen, the only Queen, above all else, our Queen. As we mourn her loss, we should also treasure her life, our longest serving and greatest ever monarch. Above the clashes of politics, she stood not for what the nation fought over, but what it agreed upon.
Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has described the death of Queen Elizabeth II as a moment of acute loss and profound sadness for the UK and the world.
For more than 70 years, Queen Elizabeth has been the great constant in our national life. She has inspired us, on occasion comforted us, and always personified values we hold dear. Throughout her reign, she performed her duties with exceptional wisdom, dedication and fidelity. Scotland loved, respected and admired her. And by all accounts, Her Majesty was rarely happier than when she was here in Scotland at her beloved Balmoral, a fact I have been privileged to observe personally. I hope it will be a source of comfort to her family that she spent her final days in a place that she loved so much.
And in Wales, Wales's First Minister, Mark Drakeford, has praised the Queen's dedication and selfless devotion following her death, aged 96.
It is with great sadness that we learn today of the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. She has been the only monarch that most of us will remember, and today the country feels an immense loss. Throughout her long and exceptional life, as our longest reigning monarch, Her Majesty firmly upheld the values and traditions of the British monarchy. On behalf of the Welsh Government and people in all parts of Wales, I offer our deepest condolences to all Her Majesty's children and their families on this sad occasion.
Ireland's Taoiseach Micheál Martin said her popularity with the Irish people was also very evident and clearly made a very positive impact on the Queen. In particular, I recall the warmth of the welcome she received from the public in Cork during her walkabout at the English market. To her grieving family and people, the Irish government join with you in mourning the loss of an exceptional woman who led by quiet and dignified example and who touched so many lives over her exceptionally long reign. In America, the US President Joe Biden and his wife Jill issued a statement saying that Queen Elizabeth II was a stateswoman of unmatched dignity and constancy who helped make our relationship special. And the White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, spoke earlier.
You know, our hearts and our thoughts go to the family members of the Queen, goes to the people of the United Kingdom, our relationship with the people of the United Kingdom, and this is something that the President has said himself, has grown stronger and stronger.
The Queen took a particularly close interest in the Commonwealth. It's something we'll talk about in a bit more detail later on. It's the voluntary association of about 50 nations which emerged from the end of the British Empire. Its leaders have expressed their gratitude for her dedication and hard work. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi said she personified dignity and decency in public life. President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa said her commitment and dedication was a noble and virtuous example to the entire world. And New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said it was a time of enormous loss.
It is with great sadness that New Zealand wakes to the news of the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. I know I speak for all New Zealanders in conveying our deepest sympathy to members of the royal family and condolences to King Charles III on behalf of the government and New Zealanders at this time of enormous loss. The last days of the Queen's life captures who she was in so many ways, working till the very end on behalf of the people she loved.
You're listening to a 5 Live News special across BBC Radio. Thank you for the text that you've been sending in to us on 85058. Ted, who's in Essex, says, when people's views seem so polarised at different ends of various spectrums, left, right, Brexit, Remain and so on, could this just be a moment to reflect on what is important for the benefit of us all? We have lost a constant of dignity, service and grace, says Ted, and these values would serve as well. And Charlie, who's in Cornwall, hi Charlie, says the Queen was an absolute inspiration. Literally a few days ago, she was still working, welcoming the new Prime Minister, taking her role as seriously as the day she started at 96 as well. Thank you very much indeed. 85058 if you'd like to share your reflections, your memories. Any contributions would be welcome this evening. Let's have a word with Margaret Holder. Margaret is a royal author who's written over a dozen documentaries about the royal family. Hello, Margaret.
Actually, it's good morning now.
It is good morning. It is indeed good morning. My thought, I suppose, is it's the very first sentence I said to our listeners this evening, really, is that it really is quite hard to imagine this country without the Queen.
It is. There's a sense of unreality. But she had a long life, so when a very elderly person dies, it's not a tragedy. It's a sadness, and there is grief, and there's loss, and there are a lot of feelings, but there's also a feeling of gladness that we knew that person. And I'm sure that's what the royal family are feeling tonight, the joy of having her in their family, of the warmth, the wisdom that she brought to them, the times that they could talk to her in their troubles, that she was, their rock. I know Liz Truss has made it that she was a national rock, but I think she was the constant in the family in very difficult times for some of them. So I think that there is a mixture when a very elderly person dies. There's sadness, and of course, if somebody is ill and they're in suffering or they're visibly shrinking, that there's a relief that their suffering is over. I know this because my father died at 98, and you do feel that with a very elderly person. that there is it's a natural process. Yes, you have to go through it, but it isn't a tragedy.
Of course. When you talk about her being a rock for other members of the royal family who are going through different trials and tribulations, you do hear people say, many people, love the royal family and indeed love the Queen. You hear others saying, I'm not entirely sure about the royal family, but I do admire and respect the Queen. You hear that a fair bit, don't you? How did she manage to completely maintain her popularity, even if other parts and other members of the royal family might have struggled in that respect?
Because she modelled herself on her parents, particularly her father, and it was going to be a lifetime of duty and service, the dedication she made on her 21st birthday. She was so much her father's daughter. And you remember the King and Queen in wartime, they were the rock for the country, if you like. And then even before then, her grandparents, George V, who was actually a very dutiful monarch, her grandmother, Queen Mary, a very formative influence on her. They stood for values which belonged to another era, and yet the Queen continued those values. And you just look at the respect now that's being shown. Look at the people outside the royal residences. Look at the tributes that are being poured out across the world for the Queen, because she had those old-fashioned values of dignity, duty, service, tolerance, as against the lack of those perhaps in her uncle who abdicated. And there you saw an example of self-indulgence. And I'm afraid we have seen self-indulgence in some of her children. And I think that has caused problems for her.
In terms of dignity and duty, I mean, these are words that we have heard repeatedly since lunchtime today, haven't we? And I saw a quote earlier on, actually, on the occasion of her Silver Jubilee. The Queen said, "When I was 21, I pledged my life to the service of our people. I asked for God's help to make good that vow. Although that vow was made in my salad days, when I was green in judgment, I do not regret nor retract one word of it," which rather sums up the years before and the years following her Silver Jubilee, doesn't it? And actually, it's worth underlining, isn't it? And actually really quite remarkable that she was still performing those duties right up to the end.
Almost to her deathbed. I mean, it is one of the things that the monarch alone can do is to appoint a new Prime Minister. That can't be done by her heir, if you like, or councillors of state. It has to be the monarch. That's the current ruling. And I think we were just fortunate that she was able to do this on Tuesday. We saw Boris Johnson going up to tender, if you like, his resignation, the end of his premiership. And then the incoming Prime Minister, Liz Truss, what's known as the kissing of hands. In fact, it's the shaking of hands and the sort of brief introduction. That was the Queen's last duty, and it was the only duty a monarch, only the monarch can perform. I think it was marvellous that she was able to do that. And we saw that those last pictures of her, this little tiny old lady, cold by the fire. You could see that her fingers were going white because she had terrible circulation problems. It's pretty obvious. And that she must have been under some medication. But she was able to do that. That was wonderful. And I'm looking now, not just all these lovely tributes that are coming in, but I'm looking to find things that show her character. I think one of the nicest tributes, actually, is from Donald Trump, of all people. And he talks about how he and Melania will never forget Her Majesty's generous friendship, great wisdom, wonderful sense of humour. What a grand and beautiful lady she was. There was nobody like her. That's a great tribute, isn't it?
It is indeed.
And how about this one from Jeremy Corbyn?
I saw Jeremy Corbyn's, yeah. Can we share it with us? Yeah, share it with us.
Yeah, this took me back. My thoughts are with the Queen's family as they come to terms with their personal loss, as well as those here and around the world who will mourn her death. I enjoy discussing our families, gardens and jam making with her. May she rest in peace. I never imagined that he would pay a tribute like that.
Well, it makes it very human, doesn't it?
It makes it human. That's
the
what
point.
I'm looking for in these. The human tributes, her sense of humour, the way that she could charm somebody like him, who's a bit of an old misery, to be fair. She could charm the birds from the trees.
It's maybe
really.
less about that. It's maybe the fact that he wasn't a natural royalist, I suppose, was he?
He was a natural
or isn't.
royalist.
Anyway, we're going to hear from a chap who's a butcher at a town near Balmoral a little later, because I'm struck by the fact we're talking about her last official duties. This butcher, who we'll hear from a little bit later, as I say, he was reflecting on being at quite an informal event about 3 weeks ago at Balmoral. It was just outside, which the Queen came out for briefly. It was still public. It was still a public event, not a public event, but, something that members of the public were still at. And, he and I reflecting on the fact that that would have probably have been her last event, in a sense, where there would have been a kind of public nature to it. I just want to ask another thing, because something else, and I don't want this to sound trivial, but of course we're going to have to get used to the fact that we will have coins, notes, stamps will begin to show the image of King Charles III. So, our lives will change, even if in quite comparatively small ways, but we'll all notice that difference.
Oh, indeed we will. And the notes, the £5, £10 notes, and everything is going to change. The coins will be different, the stamps will be different, but this will take time. And then after the funeral, there'll be, of course, the preparation for the coronation. And we'll see, what happens there. And interestingly, the Prime Minister's speech, there are a very new Prime Minister. She really has been thrown in the deep end. And it was a lovely tribute to the Queen. And right at the end, she talks about about King Charles III. We must come together as a people to support him, to help him bear the awesome responsibility that he now carries for us all. We offer him our loyalty and devotion, just as his mother devoted so much to so many for so long. That's tremendous support for Charles, more than I would have thought necessary. Maybe she feels he needs that extra bit of support because he's not as popular as his mum. Margaret,
thank you. Thank you for your thoughts this evening or this morning. Margaret Holder, who's a royal author, written a number of documentaries about the royal family. We're getting reaction from across the UK, some political reaction in that mix as well. Let's hear from Jane Dodds now. Jane's the leader of the Welsh Liberal Democrats, who called Queen Elizabeth II a great friend to Wales.
Firstly, what a sad day. Just extending our sympathies to her family. We mustn't forget that this is a loss for all of us, but such a sad day for her family and her children and her grandchildren. And, for us as a nation in Wales, we have a particularly warm relationship with the royal family, with obviously having the Prince of Wales, but with Queen Elizabeth II, such a wonderful monarch and friend to us. I was very lucky to have met her when she opened the Welsh Parliament in October last year. And I also remember a really fond occasion when I was 9 years old, and I sang in a Welsh choir for the Queen that came to my hometown of North Wales. So, I feel very, very sad on behalf of so many people, but extending my sympathies to her family as well.
What were your recollections of when she opened it was the sixth term, wasn't it, of the Senedd in October last year, in actual fact, wasn't it?
That's right. Well, I was very lucky to be able to meet her as the leader of my party, the Welsh Liberal Democrats. And as I met her, I think there were 2 or 3 things I remember about her. The first thing was that she was such a conversationalist. I guess I'd expected her maybe, to not want to know too much detail. But I remember saying to her that I represented a very large rural area in Wales, an area that probably had more sheep than people. And she laughed at that. And she said, my goodness, how do you know what they think then? And, it was, I was just really struck by that and how relational she was. And,
the common touch.
How much fun. Absolutely. How much fun and laughter she had. I think the second thing is I remember she was so lively and I got to meet her twice on that day, the first time in the formal occasions, and then later after the opening of the Parliament, she came and spoke again to us, and that was a much more relaxed opportunity, and she was very interested in the Welsh Parliament, as I know she had been over, all of the period of the Welsh Parliament being open, because she had opened all six Welsh Parliaments. So, I feel very, very sad today because I had that opportunity.
When you think of the Queen's relationship with Wales, the Duke of Edinburgh, indeed, as well, you obviously are taken back to the Aberfan disaster in 1966 as well, aren't you? And a survivor of the disaster, a guy called Jeff Edwards, in fact, he has been interviewed. He said he was immensely saddened by the death of the Queen. He said the Queen showed so much support for the people of Aberfan. She showed great compassion and concern, was genuinely interested in the community's regeneration over many years. It wasn't just support at the time of the disaster, was it? That's the point he's making. It was something that stayed with her for many, many years beyond.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I know she was particularly impacted by the tragedy at Aberfan and, remains in touch and wanting to know how that community was doing after that terrible, tragic event. I think that is something that seems to have been such a factor of her life and her monarchy, in that, as you say, she had that common touch. She was really somebody who was so human and relational and just wanted to chat to people and not only, have sad times, but happy times as well. And wanting to see that people could thrive and could move on and could be supported to see another future. And that's how I think we'll remember her in Wales. We'll remember her as somebody who really had that ability to connect with people, but also to be so in touch with their feelings.